Hello and welcome everyone to the first edition of the Future-Proof Infrastructure event in Congress. We are thrilled to welcome everyone to build a world that lasts and evolves with future generations. My name is Lorena Semp. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation and a global expert on sustainable standardization. And I will have the pleasure of being your host and guiding you through this journey. But before we start, a few housekeeping items. This event will be hybrid, and that means that there will be some speakers that will join us here in the studio in Basel and others that will join us virtually. The chat function that is currently in Zoom, you can see that it's disabled, but we will enable it during some sessions to ask questions. There will be a poll that will be launched in each session to evaluate that session. So please feel free to share your honest feedback. We are also mainstreaming live on YouTube. So for you to be here right now with us, you are agreeing for this recording to be shared publicly and for this to be mainstreamed in a public platform. This will be a dynamic program with 30-minute sessions and a break of half an hour in between. But don't worry, because I will be right there with you, guiding you through each step of the way. Finally, if you experience any technical issues, please just click on the link in the chat and our support team will be happy to provide any help you need. And now, without further ado, let's kick off the event. I would like to introduce two of the main people that have made this possible by contributing the strengths of each of our organizations. Let me introduce you Louis Downing, Chief Operating Officer of the Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation. Louis is a respected thought leader and experienced innovator and sustainability expert. Welcome, Louis.
Thanks, Lorena.
And let me also introduce Roman Imkrut, CEO of MCH Exhibitions and Events. Roman is responsible for a portfolio of more than 100 exhibitions and congresses at MCH. So, hello, Louis and Roman. Very happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Are you excited to kick off the event?
Very excited.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So, Louis, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lorena. So it's an absolute honor of mine to be kicking off this inaugural event of the Future-Proof Infrastructure Initiative, and it's great to see so many people online as well, be it on the conference link or on the live stream link. And it's great to see so many people interested and willing to engage in this topic, but it's also not difficult to see why. We're really at an inflection point in a number of different ways. We're halfway on our journey to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda. We're 7.5 years down, 7.5 years to go. And we've got some really big milestones that we've reached. We've made huge strides forward, but we've also got some unprecedented challenges that we're facing. So the impacts of climate change are accelerating. That we're all aware of. 79% of global greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to infrastructure, which is really remarkable. Getting this right has never been more critical for both people and planet. The current macroeconomic and also geopolitical landscape is making building sustainable infrastructure in some ways a lot more challenging. Sustainable infrastructure is often very capex heavy, as we know, and opex light. And as interest rates rise, this could potentially create some really big issues for financing the kind of infrastructure that we really need to build. So, the general landscape, we're still missing about $1 to $2 trillion US per year, depending on which study you read. Private finance has actually stagnated over the last 8 or 9 years, according to the most recent Global Infrastructure Hub report, released a couple of weeks ago. And we've actually seen a reduction of about 8% in emerging economies. So that's exactly the opposite trend to what we want to see to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That's why we're all here, basically. That's what future-proof infrastructure is all about. We want to drive a dialogue on future-proof infrastructure. You know, what projects do we need to build now for the future? We want to ground that discussion in concrete projects. We want to concretely demonstrate, you know, what sustainable infrastructure means for an investor, and we want to underpin this thesis that sustainability features in infrastructure actually provide a better risk-adjusted return. Thirdly, we also want to create connections between all the actors along the value chain who are going to make that happen. So we're talking about project developers, financiers, suppliers, and the whole ecosystem that surrounds an excellent infrastructure project. Ultimately, we really want to be facilitating deals here as well, and that's really, really important. So we hope you really enjoy the day. We have some great speakers lined up, both here in the studio and also remotely. We'll be covering a range of topics, including public-private partnerships, project preparation, finance from the perspective of national development banks, but also long-term private investors, which is a very, very interesting discussion. We'll be diving into the topic of nature-based solutions, which is very interesting. We'll also be talking about the Fast Infra Initiative, so the finance to accelerate sustainable transition. Let me leave it there. I'm going to pass it to Roman to give some introductory remarks from our partner MCH.
Thank you very much, Louis. Hello everyone. My name is Roman. I am the CEO of the Exhibition and Events Division at MCH Group. We are one of the largest exhibition organizers in the world, and at the core of what we've been doing for over 100 years is to bring stakeholders together around important topics in the industry to help foster an exchange that will help shape the future. We are convinced that the challenges that lay ahead of us in order to create a planet that is worth living in for our children and grandchildren, they are immense, and they will require all of us to make a contribution. This is why we have launched the Sustainability Days in Basel, where stakeholders from many different disciplines come together to exchange on concrete solutions and approaches to build a better, more future-proof world. We are also convinced of the importance and urgency, especially also outlined by Louis, around the topic of sustainable infrastructure, which is why we have partnered with the Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation to launch the Future-Proof Infrastructure as part of the Sustainability Days events. I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to attend this first edition, and I wish you very interesting discussion interactions in the program that lays ahead, and I would like to pass back to Louis. Thank you very much, Louis.
Thanks so much, Roman. So I want to jump into one element of the Future-Proof Infrastructure platform, which is the Content Hub. The Content Hub is somewhere where, I mean, from GIB's perspective, we're a non-profit international NGO focusing on sustainable and resilient infrastructure. We believe that change starts with a conversation. And this Content Hub is where we're hosting that conversation throughout the year. The conversation is about what infrastructure do we need to build now for the future, essentially. So through the Content Hub, you can access knowledge in the form of articles, blog posts, on cutting-edge topics. You can connect with partners. You can navigate the annual event and access early stage live infrastructure projects. We've curated a pipeline of more than 50 excellent infrastructure projects together with our partners. Together with our partners, a range of project preparation facilities globally. And these projects are early stage. They're highly promising in terms of both their ability to drive sustainability and resilience, whilst also having an attractive risk-return profile in the short, mid, and long term. They're projects that support, at a very granular level, this thesis that environmental and social sustainability is not just doing the right thing, it's also good business. This is something that we're going to discuss in a bit more detail throughout the day. But let's first just take a sneak peek at some of the projects within the pipeline. So we have transport projects, which are effectively moving goods and people to promote economic and social development whilst minimising environmental impact. We have energy projects, which are enhancing renewable energy production, helping our transition away from fossils whilst safeguarding other sustainability objectives. We have social projects, which which help to balance the trade-offs between land use, food production, and providing healthy spaces to live. And finally, we have nature-based solutions, which are just an amazing way in which we can leverage so-called ecosystem services to provide critical services to population, so including flood risk reduction, water treatment, cooling in an atmosphere of increasing heat waves in terms of magnitude and also severity and frequency. So that's why I'm excited today. Without further ado, I want to pass it back to our anchor, Lorena, who's going to get us started on the main content.
Thank you so much, Roman. Thank you so much, Louis, for those great introductory words. It is really a powerful partnership here that we have with GIV and MCH. And that links perfectly to our next session. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Lorena.
Thank you very much.
And I'm happy to go to our next session, which we have heard about what we're here together to do, to really build a future that would last and evolve with generations through infrastructure. But in order to do that, we need actors that support and help us. And it is here where project preparation actors play a pivotal role. To moderate this panel and joining us virtually, I am very pleased to introduce Andy Deacon. He is co-managing director of the Global Covenant of Majors for Climate and Energy, a renowned expert with over 20 years of experience in environmental protection issues, climate change, energy, and quality at the local and regional central government. Joining Andy here from the studio, we will have one of the speakers that has traveled a long way, from Geneva to join us live. So he will join us in a few minutes here. I see that Andy is already with us in Zoom. Andy, how are you feeling at the moment?
Good. Thank you very much for the opportunity to moderate this discussion, and very much looking forward to getting into it today.
Thank you so much, Andy. So allow me to welcome with us Tony. Tony, please, if you can join me here at the stage. So Tony, how are you feeling?
Very, very excited. Very looking forward to the discussion.
Perfect. So I will let Andy formally introduce Tony and the rest of our wonderful speakers. And Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody, and thanks for joining and following along today. So this session will start to explore in a little more detail the role of various project preparation facilities and the way in which they are helping to integrate sustainable infrastructure considerations as then project promoters are developing ideas and bringing them forwards. So as already mentioned, I'm co-managing director of the Global Covenant of Mayors based in Brussels. I'm the world's largest city network taking action on climate change, over 12,500 signatory cities and 13 regional and national covenants covering more than 1 billion people across the globe within their cities. And our interest is in the local government and municipal angle to all of this, and helping cities to move their climate action plans from citywide strategies and action plans to individual projects, advancing, whether individually or part of a citywide portfolio, to securing end investment and advancing to implementation. And you're going to hear today from three fantastic panelists who have 5 minutes each, and then a chance for us to get into some discussion just to set out the role of the particular facilities that they're supporting. I'll let each of them introduce themselves and then make their remarks. But let's make a start and get into it. First up, I'm going to come to Pedro Nicolau, Integration Manager for Source. So Pedro, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role, and then dive in and give us your thoughts on the role of project preparation facilities and some of the amazing work that Source is doing. Over to you first.
Thank you, Andy, for the introduction. And thank you for the invitation to join this conference. As a quick overview about myself, I am an integration manager working for SIF, the Sustainable Infrastructure Foundation. As of right now, we are working globally to implement the platform source within governments and countries, and I have been directly involved in the integration in Indonesia, Angola, and South Africa. And basically, SIF is an NGO based here also in Geneva, which leads the provision of the platform source, that is the multilateral development platform for project preparation. Well, as Andy also mentioned, I'm gonna do my first remarks regarding the platform, but basically the source was created as an instrument to support governments in project preparation, aiming as the main objective, the well-prepared projects, a well-prepared pipeline of projects that can also boost and mobilization of private and international finance for the infrastructure projects. As of right now, Source is working alongside with multiple players in terms of digitalizing frameworks and methodologies for project preparation and project assessment. We have been working close to UNECE and CCFLA in terms of digitalizing project assessments and to make sure they are going to be available on Source. And basically, Source can play a supporting role for governments when preparing projects by 5 main functionalities. The first one is providing a collaborative, secure environment where governments can invite third parties to participate in project preparation phase. That can include MDBs, the private sector, PPF around the world. Also, the Source platform has digitalized what we call a common framework that was developed alongside with MDBs and also the private sector, which we received over 7,000 comments regarding these templates. And they gather mainly all the best practices in terms of project structuring. Also, Source has digitalized and provided for governments using Source what we call the PPF Finder, in which governments, they can check which MDBs, international organizations, including CCFLA members, that can help them to better structure those projects. So the platform itself provides this matchmaking between PPFs and the projects. Fourth, through the project assessment tools that we have been digitalizing into Source, they can assess their projects according to different standards and international methodologies, such as the Fasting for Sustainable Infrastructure label. And also now we are working close to the UNECE to digitalize the PPPs for SDGs. And finally, by publishing the well-prepared projects to the private sector, Source can also welcome comments and contributions from the private sector and third parties in regards to the project and the project preparation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and that's very clear in regards to the role that Source plays, and very helpful to set out those linkages to other facilities. And there's a few points there that we'll come back to in our discussion part of this session in just a few moments' time. So next, and I hope everything is going smoothly in the studio, then I will come to you, Tony Bonici, Head of PPE for UNECE. Over to you to introduce yourselves and give a few remarks about the role of project preparation as well. Over to you.
Thank you, Andy, and it's a pleasure to be with you from the studios in Basel. Yes, so my name is Tony Bonici, and I have the privilege and the honor to lead the PPP program at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE. And it's a pleasure also to be on this panel as well. I think it was Louis who alluded to it in his opening. Achieving or implementing the Sustainable Development Goals is one of the key objectives, if not the key objectives, that we have at the moment. I'm not talking just only about the United Nations, but I think I would also include the international community. We are halfway through there, and I'm not sure we are doing that well, because all the reports we are getting indicate that we are lagging behind in achieving a number of these goals. Of course, we can point fingers at wars, at crises, at pandemics. But the fact of the matter is that we are lagging a little bit behind, and we need to catch up in the next 7.5 years. In other words, we need to do more going forward, more than we have done in the past 7.5 years. Infrastructure is everywhere if you go through the 17 goals. Infrastructure spending in terms of billions, trillions even of dollars are needed in order to implement the SDGs. And this infrastructure spending, it's not only in developed countries, but perhaps mostly in low and middle income countries. And this is one of the key challenges that we are seeing at the moment. How to make sure that investment goes where it needs to go, rather than only in developed countries. This is what triggered us to start thinking about how to help our governments, our client member states, to develop and implement projects, more specifically with private investment, in various forms of public-private partnerships. And this is it. So the SDGs in 2015, they pose a huge challenge to public-private partnerships, because they are included in both the text, but also in the other implementing documents, such as the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, for example, which calls for PPPs as a way to finance infrastructure. But we know how PPPs have been developed in the past. They have been developed in developed countries as an economic tool, with a little bit of add-ons along the over the years to also give a little bit of importance to the environmental considerations, but also to society at large. The SDGs have changed all that, because the SDGs since 2015, they treat the 3 pillars of sustainability equally. So we are no longer having to privilege one over the other. We have 3 pillars of sustainability, and we need to look at them in an equal fashion. So this is what triggered us at UNEC in Geneva to start with our experts and networks and member states to come up with an evaluation methodology, which we called an evaluation methodology in support of the SDGs. And it is not only about public-private partnerships. It is applicable to all kinds of infrastructure projects. And what we do is we are giving equal importance to the 3 pillars of sustainability. Now, you might tell me, why do we need a new methodology? We have so many already, and I think Pedro has mentioned a few that are hosted at source. I think the reason is simple. We saw a void in the. There is no methodology that is only focused on helping the governments, the member states, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is what our methodology is focusing on, and it is complementary to what is out there. So we are not telling government A, listen, just forget about all your value for money tools, business case that you were doing in the past. Now you have to replace all that by this methodology. No, what we are saying is you have to keep doing what you're doing. Value for money is crucial. Unless projects are bankable, there is no way that you can attract private finance. What we are saying is that use this methodology as a complementary tool to make sure to what extent your project is contributing to the SDGs. And what we even say is that the tool can be used at any stage, any time during the project, in any sector, in any country, in any region in the world. But there is a, and this is what I like, what Louis was saying in his introductory remarks, the early stage of projects, because there is a particular phase around the pre-feasibility stage where you have enough information that you can, go forward, or you can assess whether, this is going to be bankable or not. But you still have enough leeway to make adjustments, to make changes, to do, for example, stakeholder engagement, which all governments, are failing so incredibly. And many of the projects that we see are fail because of, not enough stakeholder consultation. So this is what we are saying, that there is a time during the project preparation period where the methodology, you get the most out of it. Of course, as a capacity building tool, the methodology can be used anytime, because what you learn, you can apply it to your future project. So if you are in construction, if you start pouring concrete, and of course, it's too late a little bit to do stakeholder engagement. But what you learn from that exercise, you can use it for your future project. So in short, this is it. So the methodology is free of charge. It's a self-assessment, so you don't need consultants to come and do it for you. So governments, and we give support to government as well, how to do a few of their projects, and then they can do the rest. And it is available on our website. As I said, it's a public good, so it's free of charge. It has been taught for our governments as a key sort of user, but it is being used by academia, by private sector as well. And to date, I'm very happy to announce that although it is relatively new, it has been on the market for just 1 year, it has already been used in over 200 projects. So we are seeing, so I was looking in the train from Geneva this morning, I was looking at some statistics, and I could see that we have like 68 projects now that have been evaluated this year alone, and the whole ticket is something like $38 billion. So we're talking about huge investments, huge infrastructure investment, and the more the methodology is used, and this is why I'm happy to team up with Source and with Pedro and his team in Geneva, that the more we promote, the more we make it available as a public good, the more time we have to make up for the to pick up the pace, I would say, of SDG implementation in the next 7.5 years. Thank you, Andy. I will stop here for the moment.
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much. And just so you're primed as well, then on that pre-feasibility question, then definitely would like to come back to that during the discussion. And you also made some important points about linkages between the public and private sectors. And we'll also come back to that. The Global Covenant of Mayors are partners in the City Climate Finance Gap Fund, and being overseen and implemented by World Bank and European Investment Bank, and at subnational level for municipalities. That is exactly trying to overcome that gap at pre-feasibility funding stage, and also very much take your and Pedro's points about the proliferation of kind of guidance tools and standards. And 𝐏𝐫𝐶, we're also a founding member of this relatively new body called the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, 𝐼𝐧𝐼, and you'll hear a bit from their coordinator during the next session, but their kind of review of guidance tools and standards unearthed quite a number, and maybe that's a topic that we can also return to in a few minutes time as well. But no, thank you. Very good that you were able to pick up on Pedro's comments, but then add some of your own flavor to that. And for everybody who's joining us online, yes, that kind of free resource is there, and would encourage as many people as possible to adopt it and take a look and make use. So then our final panelist, I'm going to come to 𝐼𝐮𝐿 then from CDIA, their communications and outreach specialist. Tell us a little bit about the picture as you see it in your region, and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, and warm greetings from Manila, everyone. So I am 𝐼𝐮𝐿. I'm the Communications and Outreach Specialist of Cities Development Initiative for Asia. And I'm actually happy to join you today on behalf of CDIA. CDIA is a project preparation facility, and as such, we work with secondary cities in Asia and the Pacific to prepare bankable, climate resilient, and sustainable infrastructure projects. So we also help link cities to financing and build local capacities towards sustainable implementation of priority investments. So we are a multi-donor trust fund managed by the Asian Development Bank, and we are supported by various governments such as Austria, France, Germany, Republic of Korea, Switzerland, and Spain, also by the European Union and the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund of ADB. So we have been in existence since 2007, and we have worked with over 130 cities in 22 developing member countries of ADB. So we have commissioned 118 project preparation studies, out of which we have linked an estimated $12.2 billion of infrastructure investment to downstream financing. So we provide technical assistance to cities, which can take in the forms of pre-feasibility study, feasibility study, due diligence activities, and at times, depending on what the city needs, we can also do preliminary design. So we work across different urban sectors, like we have projects on wastewater management, transport, water supply, drainage and flood management, solid waste management, and urban renewal, among others. So currently, we are managing 9 projects, which are in the Philippines, Vietnam, Laos, PDR, and Thailand, Cambodia, Kyrgyz Republic, Bhutan, as well as we have 3 projects in Bangladesh. So these projects are expected to be linked to various financing agencies, including public-private partnership. So we support projects that emphasize poverty reduction, environmental improvement, climate change mitigation and or adaptation, and good governance. And considering as well that our work is focused on cities, all our studies are expected to contribute to the achievement of SDG 11, which aims to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And of course, its sub-goals. At the same time, we also aim to contribute to other SDGs, such as SDG 1, SDG 6, and SDG 13, among others. So we are mostly focused on secondary cities, and we help them become more livable. In fact, we support climate resilient development through adaptation and mitigation measures, including nature-based solutions. We also promote inclusion of all vulnerable groups, including women, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. And of course, we promote innovation and also help strengthen the implementation and management skills of implementers on the ground. So how do we actually work with cities? So primarily, we deploy a consulting team with both international and domestic expertise to help city officials and their stakeholders in the project preparation study. Together, we identify and analyze the city's development concerns and issues. Then we work with them to determine their top priority investments. Out of the identified investments, we then work to establish, their viability, including their technical, environmental, social, financial, and economic due diligence, as well as we integrate climate resilience into the project design and help to establish a good governance framework. So along with the project preparation study, we also assess the city's capacities and institutional gaps and develop roadmaps for their improvement. So on the average, our project preparation studies amount to about $500,000. And of course, that's depending on the nature and the size of the project. And typically, our study takes about 6 to 8 months. So before I end, I would like to invite everyone, if you have time, to visit our website, cdia.asia, to know more about our work and how we can possibly work together to prepare bankable, climate resilient, and sustainable infrastructure projects. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Anne. And I'm going to come straight back to you first, maybe. One of the questions that came up, is around the ability to engage very early in the project lifecycle at pre-feasibility stage. Could you maybe just say a little bit about how you're helping to overcome some of the gap that otherwise is there in the ability to assess projects at that very early stage, and to make sure that they are addressing as many of the SDG considerations as possible?
All right, thanks, Andy, for that question. In terms of sustainability considerations, we do give attention to them right at the beginning of our project preparation study. And, at CDIA, we look at not only, establishing the technical viability of the project, but we also look at how the project is going to impact the people, how it will improve the environment, for example, and how it will contribute to the sustainable development of a city. And as I have mentioned earlier, key to our project preparation study is the integration of capacity development and institutional strengthening, because we feel that we need to help the cities to be able to implement and maintain the proposed infrastructure investments for a long period of time, even without external support. So thank you.
Thank you. Great. And Pedro, maybe you want to kind of say a little bit more about how far upstream then kind of source is able to support projects, and just how then information that you're gathering can be used to build in the widest possible set of sustainability considerations as early in the project as possible.
Sure. Thank you, Andy. So as some of you know, SOURCE is an online software that facilitates the project documentation. So we, as SIF and SOURCE, we do not act in terms of as a PPF, for instance, but we basically, what SOURCE is doing is helping governments to organize their documentations, their information, and also to identify possible gaps and needs inside a project that then they can maybe contact a PPF or an MDB that can help them, or even investors to help them to address those needs for that specific project. So some of the examples that we have is the common framework, the templates that SOURCE has available for over 40 sectors. They are based on international best practices like APMG or BFRAM or any other OECD principles also for PPPs. And they help governments to better prepare projects and also to identify via algorithms where they have these possible gaps. So we have deployed what we call the risk matrix inside SOURCE, that you can identify possible gaps according to international best practices and where you can act, as well as the PPF that I mentioned before, that you can invite other third parties to participate and help you to address these specific gaps and specific needs. And just to mention something that I forgot in my first time, is that SOURCE is also a global public good that's available for all governments that want to implement and integrate within their PPP units or Ministry of Finance and etc. So it's also available for all governments that may be interested. Thank you, Randy.
Indeed, that's an important point, and thank you for that clarification, Pedro, as well as setting out that pre-feasibility kind of opportunity, and very important to identify these gaps at early stage. Tony, anything you want to add in that regard around the role of the UNECE tool in building in those considerations at pre-feasibility stage?
Yes, thank you, Andy. So yes, we at UNECE get engaged very, very early in projects. So I mean, the United Nations is not an investor, right? So we are not directly investing into projects, and that's an advantage to a certain extent. Of course, the other side of the coin is that we have less resources, but that is what enables us to have our impartiality and independence when we talk to governments. So when we talk to governments at the very high level, at the very early stage, they know that governments are aware that we are not the one taking it forward from the beginning up until the end. So at some point, and that point is pre-feasibility. We do not do pre-feasibility studies. We do not do feasibility studies. So there is a point where we pass the project, as it were, to the multilateral development banks. Usually, when we're talking about low and middle income countries, and then they will do the pre-feasibility and the feasibility study if they see that there is potential for the project to go forward. So our role is really there at the early stage, almost. When ministers are whispering their ideas in a room, what could be a possible, project, to a concept note, I would say, that would be the time. But we know that that's a very delicate time, because governments mostly are on their own in this very delicate time, because a lot of facilities that exist around the world would ask governments to give them a little bit more information than that. That they want, they want almost a pre-feasibility, I would say, before they decide whether to get engaged or not. So that's a very delicate time, and it's a very lonely time for our member states, for our countries. That's why we try to sort of be in that space as much as we can, and do as much as we can to assist. But it's a very interesting time, and it has to be 100% government managed. We strongly believe that particular phase, because when you are getting involved other stakeholders, private sector and that, you are not sure whether the advice is coming because there is an interest further down the line to get involved in the project, or whether it's a genuine, support to the government. So that's why we try to occupy that space as much as we can, and with the resources that we have.
No, really helpful. Thank you very much. And then wanted to turn a little to engaging with investors. Obviously, future-proof infrastructure is trying to help projects develop and advance and secure that end investment. But maybe I'll come back to you, Pedro. Kind of how and where do you see investors being engaged in some of these conversations? At which stages of project development? And as Tony says, these can be very delicate discussions. What's your view on how we can best broker some of those conversations with the private as well as the public sectors?
Well, as Tony said, we know that's a delicate decision to involve and to invite investors for projects, we always make sure that these by the users of source is a decision by the government when they want to invite any third part to a specific project. So as SIF, we do not involve when they are inviting third parties to participate. We as a platform, we basically make sure that they have the tools and they can invite third parties to participate in project preparation. And as Source has been deployed now with governments, we are also collecting more information regarding when they would prefer to invite third parties. As also Source is a public good, only the governments have access to their own data. So as specific conversations we have with governments, they can provide specific cases or when they would be the best cases to participate. But as the platform, we would not know, because each government has your own decision on when invite them to specific projects.
No, thank you. That's helpful just to gather that understanding. And maybe let me come back to you. You mentioned work with a number of development banks. In your opening remarks is one side of the equation. And how are you then kind of addressing the engagement of the private sector also in conversations through CDIA?
Thanks, Andy. So indeed, most of our experience as we link projects to development banks. So our experience is kind of more on that regard. And usually our experience is that we involve MDBs as early as possible, and we engage them all throughout the study. And actually, if I may just share, beginning 2018, we made it a requirement in our city application, to provide an indicative link to financing to ensure that our studies don't end up in shelves and they do get picked up by downstream funders. With regards to our two studies that we are eyeing for public-private partnership, usually we have a national partner organization, a national government agency that we engage all throughout the study. In the case of the Philippines, it is the Public-Private Partnership Center of the Philippines, and their involvement every step of the way of the project would help bring better understanding of the context of and the issues surrounding the proposed project, and enable them to also build that sense of ownership and full support to the priority investment, because after all, they are going to help lead the cities to take the project further along the PPP track. So that's our experience. Thank you, Andy.
No, thank you very much. That's very clear. And Tony, maybe just to round us out on this one, then you mentioned the delicate nature of those conversations. But from your work with kind of governments and member states, where are you seeing the private sector come in, and any tips or advice for those people kind of watching and joining us online as to just the sort of timing or nature of the approach, other than, as you said, whispering in the right people's ears at the right moment?
Thank you, Andy. I don't think that there is a scientific exercise. I don't think that there is a very precise time. But what we do is that we do encourage our governments that we work with to do soft market testing, to test the market, to see if there is interest by the investors and by the private sector to go there. It is very delicate, simply because governments have many. For example, when you're talking about public-private partnerships, we know what we're talking about. But then there are other types of investments. Governments can go directly with a private company, and they use other types of legislation with the host of issues that are raised. Going that route, which I'm not going to mention. But of course, the issue of corruption comes up very often when you're talking about these kind of deals. Although we encourage governments to engage, with the investors, with the private sector, we would love to have a little bit of work already done before this is undertaken. So, for example, what we are doing with the tool that I mentioned, the evaluation methodology, is that when a government is able to complete the whole methodology, it means that they have enough information to go public. So that's a good time to use the score with the investors and see, listen, from the SDG, ESG perspective, we score very high on this particular project. Please look at it. We know that many investors have many choices where to put their money, and it is so challenging to drive investment into low and middle income countries, and we're talking about below level investment grade countries here, the B minuses, etc. So how to drive investment there? So we know how hard it is, and even these governments realize how hard it is. So if through a tool or through, for example, the source platform, there is a way that investors could see projects and at least look at them. I'm not saying they should take our word and invest in them, but at least look at them, examine them, and consider them in your investment strategies, and see to what extent you can work with that particular government. I think that's a pretty comprehensive, as a comprehensive answer as I could give you, Andy, at this point.
No, that's perfect and really helpful and very practical. Thank you. And thank you also to colleagues who are joining online. I see a few open questions in the question and answer box. Maybe in our last few minutes, let's try and take at least a couple of those. If anybody wants to come in. So there's a question on the fact that finance for adaptation is lagging far behind where it needs to be, and whether any of our panelists would, which approaches they would recommend to get adaptation projects like the drainage projects mentioned a while ago, finance. So open question on how do we attract more finance for adaptation projects. And maybe Anne, if you want to come in on that one.
Yes, thank you, Andy. So with regards to your question, at CDIA, we actually mainstream climate resilience principles in our project preparation study, because we feel that integrating them at the early stage is more effective, and less costly than when they're integrated towards the later time when infrastructure projects have already gone through the process of project development. So specifically with regards to the adaptation, what we usually do in our studies is include climate vulnerability and risk assessment, so that we can be informed of the project's exposure, the level of hazards, the sensitivity, and also the capacity to adapt. So having all this information would now allow us to be able to determine what would be the adaptation options that we can integrate in the investments that we are developing with the cities. That's it from CDIA. Thanks.
No, that's great. Thank you. And moving towards wrapping up, I'll just come around to each of you, either for anything you've forgotten, or as we move into future further sessions of the Future Proof Infrastructure Conference, then just kind of any advice on how we move projects from working through PPFs to then securing end investment. Maybe just a couple of closing remarks from you. Let's come to you, Pedro, first.
Thank you, Andy. So as the closing remarks, I think we just would like to mention that the source platform can specifically help governments that are looking to structure well-prepared projects and seeking for both finance or investors. And we have been digitalizing multiple tools that can also help to bridge this gap between the needs of the projects and what the investors are looking for, and also to better communicate this to the specific markets once, as Tony mentioned, when the projects are published. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anne, to you next.
Yeah, basically from my end, what I would probably like to highlight is partnership, because we understand that cities need to go through the very rigorous process of preparation for their infrastructure projects to be able to establish their bankability and make their project attractive for downstream investors. But as you can see, that there is a lot of support, that cities can turn to for their needs. We know that there is a lot that the cities would need to do. They have a lot of challenges as well as limitations, but with partnership, we can help them address their development issues. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. That's absolutely music to my ears and those of the Global Covenant of Mayors. There's definitely demand, but also opportunities to partner up at multiple levels of engagement to provide that support. So thank you. And finally, to close us out, Tony, any last closing remarks?
Thank you, Andy, for this opportunity. Let me go back to my opening. In my opening, I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals and how we are lagging a little bit behind, and how we need to do more in the next 7.5 years than what we did in the past 7.5 years. And one of the challenges, of course, is the flow of finance. How can we ensure that private finance goes where it needs to go? I think this is the key challenge. And I'm not talking about OECD countries here, I'm talking about low and middle income countries. It's not, this is it. And for me, the battle for the SDGs is going to be won or lost by how efficient or effective we as an international community are to mobilize finance into infrastructure in low and middle income countries.
No, very clear. Thank you very much. So I hope you've all heard something about some tools and services to assist in that process. My thanks again to Tony, Pedro, and Anne for those excellent contributions, for getting us going, for being clear and concise. I hope those of you following online found those kind of context setting as well as our discussion helpful, and I'll hand you on to the team that are leading the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy, for moderating such an insightful session, and thank you to all wonderful speakers for all those very insightful comments, and Tony as well for joining and staying here with us. So please stay here with me, as we will like to hear more about from you in the next session. So we have heard about project preparation actors. We have also heard about the mission for a more sustainable and future-proof infrastructure future. And now on to our next session, where we will hear about the importance of a well-rounded, efficient curation process. And to moderate this discussion, please join me in welcoming again here in the studio Louis Downing, the Chief Executive Officer, of Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation. So Louis, ready to tackle the next session?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Lorena.
Thank you. So you have the floor.
Great, thanks. So I'm really excited about this session. Tony, we're not going to let you go away yet. Thanks for joining again for this session. So Tony is actually one of the members of the Future-Proof Infrastructure jury, together with a total of 8 members. We're joined by one other member, 𝐶𝐵𝐼𝐻𝐼 𝐏-𝐫𝐶, who also heads up the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. Welcome, 𝐶𝐵𝐼𝐻. Thanks very much for joining us. And dialing in also is Jim Pass from Guggenheim Partners, who's providing us an external perspective from an infrastructure investor's perspective. Jim, in his own right, and in his role with Guggenheim Partners, is a excellent advocate of sustainable infrastructure and has been responsible for publishing a range of different reports tackling different issues of sustainable infrastructure. Now, the Future-Proof Infrastructure jury comprises 8 members, which include a range of stakeholders across the infrastructure value chain. In addition to Savina and Tony, who are joining us today, there's also representatives from Swiss Re, from GRESP, from Tavis Capital, 𝐿𝐭𝐮𝐿, the Chinese Association for Consulting Engineers, and the EBRD as well. So it's a very broad spectrum group, and they're basically charged with the duty of pointing GIB in the right direction as to which kind of projects should we be sourcing as we create the pipeline of infrastructure projects for future-proof infrastructure. So I'm going to start with you, Tony. Can you tell us a little bit, as a jury member, what you consider as being important features that make an infrastructure project future-proof?
Thank you, Louis, and again, a pleasure to be here in this session. I believe future-proof is about sustainability, and I think you mentioned that, Louis, in your introductory remarks. And here I want to be repetitive, and I want to mention that sustainability for us means achieving the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Future-proof is about resilience. It is about high-quality infrastructure. It's also about inclusiveness, circularity, moving from a linear to a circular economy. Infrastructure that is also fiscally sustainable, so that future generations are not indebted with, as a result of the decisions that we make today. Infrastructure that is also capable of being replicated and scaled up. It's the scale that we need to achieve, right, in order to move forward and achieve the 2030 agenda. Replicated not only in the country, but also in other countries. So governments, being inspired by their neighbors and take over, some of their ideas. And we have seen this happening quite a little bit in some social infrastructure. So, in other words, we're talking about infrastructure that, yes, it is bankable and economically effective, but that it's also environmentally sustainable. Here we're talking about climate change, pollution, loss of biodiversity, and infrastructure that embraces the 3 pillars of sustainability, which is the economic, the social, and the environment equally, with us, everyone, people, as the main beneficiaries of this infrastructure.
Thanks a lot, Tony. So you just covered a range of the points that when we met with the jury communicated to GIB. This is the kind of infrastructure that we're looking for. Another topic that really came up in that discussion was the focus on early stage infrastructure, that we need to really shift, and focus on projects that are in early stage if we're to be able to have a really good impact on the trajectory of those projects. So, Savina, you're a civil engineer. You also represent or head up an organisation that represents civil engineers. Could you talk to us a little bit about the technical elements of, why is it important to engage in early stage infrastructure projects, and what does that enable us to do?
Yes, thank you, and hi everyone. I think just to put things in perspective, the long lifespan of infrastructure project means that choices that we're making in the early stages of a project could lock in bad decision or good decision for decades to come. So I think that's why the early stage of development of infrastructure projects is so important, and we need to prioritize investment in infrastructure.
Are you with us, Savina? I think we've lost you for a minute. I think we've lost Savina. She might come back online. In the meantime, we might move to you, Jim. So, Jim, from the perspective of an investor, how do you see the value or the importance of this process that we're aiming to achieve here with the future-proof infrastructure platform? What do you see as some of the opportunities, some of the challenges that you think we should be aware of as we're curating a pipeline of future-proof infrastructure projects?
Well, if I guess first, let me thank you for inviting me and welcome to all the visitors or the people in the audience as well as everybody on the internet. I think the topic is very, very timely because when we're looking at in today's environment with all the financial uncertainty in the banking system on a global basis, when we start looking to put capital in long duration assets, and duration is a word that probably everybody is hearing more and more about, we want to make sure that putting capital in today is not going to require capital within 18 months or 24 months due to an engineering mistake or a different stakeholder coming to the forefront. So really what Guggenheim and other investors, I think, would rather be willing to pay more today or put in more equity or take out or provide a larger loan if that means deferred maintenance or building an infrastructure is more resilient with the 17 goals in mind. And I think it's important to realize that with so much need around the world, we need to have some type of measurement to analyze and allow individuals like myself and other financiers making sure that they understand the return on their investment in the financial sense, but also what is the return in the terms of sustainability, how it's impacting the human element, the environment element, as well as is it really transparent. And I think during my studies, Louis, as you highlighted, what we have seen is that if investors can identify and manage, the goals and manage the performance in what I would say a very qualitative field, more private capital will flow. And when you have trillions of dollars of need around the globe, financial institutions, financial firms, and so forth, if we can manage and identify the risk, then should be willing to put our capital at risk. So it's really, if there's metrics that can be managed, then we can manage the financial aspect. So in many ways, I think it's very comparable to what the other speakers have talked about. Getting individuals involved early is very, very critical to that process, because then we can understand what are the options, and if a road goes left rather than straight, as simple as that may sound, could be worth billions of dollars in saving the environment or preserving the environment in certain locations.
Really interesting points. Thanks, Jim. And I mean, something that I pick up from what you're saying is you're diving right into some of the granular details of saying which elements of an infrastructure project will actually affect positively or negatively the business case for that project, but also the broader context, social and environmental. And I think from our perspective, that's something that we notice a lot. There's a lot of dialogue in very general terms about sustainable infrastructure. But we're actually talking about all sorts of sectors and subsectors and contexts and geographies, which make every project very unique. I wonder, I can see Savina's back online again. Maybe you could pick up where you left off, which also speaks to some of Jim's points.
Yeah. Apologies, lack of resilience in the telecommunications. I was thinking I don't know where you lost me, but I made the point that we need to prioritize worthy rather than shovel-ready projects. And I was about to give you an example of, given the interconnected nature of infrastructure, when something goes wrong, then the impact of failures compounds. Just to kind of bring it to life a little bit. So when flooding, for example, takes down critical infrastructure, transport links, then communities can be broken and isolated for days. The key workers cannot get to hospitals, the kids cannot get to school. When energy networks are down, trains can't run. Water cannot get distributed. When the telecoms are down, we cannot pay for our goods. We cannot access internet. We cannot get cash. So you can see how this can rapidly kind of spirals into like a wider and a wider impact. But in addition to the kind of this type of damages and losses and kind of short-term loss of service, the economic shock waves are very far-reaching. Just think about broken supply chain, loss in productivity, but also the unquantifiable losses, such as lost education I mentioned, and disruption of young lives, impact on mental health. So you know, like that is so important that then infrastructure continues to provide those essential services, and then more broadly, it continues to enable the outcomes that it should be designed for, so supporting the sustainable development and triple bottom line benefits that were mentioned before. So we really need to think holistically about infrastructure, and sometimes technical people, they just see us, or they're designers of the physical piece of infrastructure, but actually engineers and technical experts can be a big help when we're trying to identify those shovel-worthy projects. So traditionally, we are getting called in, the experts and the engineers are getting called in when the projects are already being prioritized, selected, and investment decision has already been made. So we're getting called in to do then the project right, because we know the built environment, we know about how the infrastructure is planned, designed, built, operated, and maintained. But we also know, we're also system thinkers, and we also know how this is connecting to the wider system and how to enable positive outcomes for infrastructure. So I think we can be a big help, not just in doing the project right, but also to influence what the right projects are in the first place. So if the engineering community, and by no means it's only just civil engineers or just engineers, but if we are involved in the early stages of development of the infrastructure, when I said they're so important in locking in the good decision, then we can provide better understanding of the systemic interconnected risks. We can provide more robustness and science to the risk assessments. It can also help shape those positive outcomes that infrastructure should really deliver, locking in the best practice solutions for the long term.
Thanks so much, Savina. There's a huge range of different topics that you've covered there. This richness of the interconnectivity and also interdependency of different infrastructure projects, and the need to get the right people involved at the right time, which is early. Can I turn to you, Tony? Now you're coming at this from a different perspective, heading up the PPP mission of UNECE. Why is that not happening? So why are we not getting the right people involved early enough in the infrastructure projects? What needs to change to make that happen, and who do we need at the table?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question, and as I was mentioning earlier in the previous panel, there is a space from the very, very early that a project is being almost whispered in a small room up to the pre-feasibility, where it's a very lonely time for the government. And we know that it is very sensitive. So there is a lot of sensitivity of information, of involving investors too early. But we do encourage governments to get engaged with investors, to sound out the market, to see whether there is appetite in the market to do that kind of project. And I think out of probably frustrations, a number of facilities have mushroomed in the past, I would say, 10, 12 years. And you have seen that, especially from the multilateral development banks, that from downstream they are coming upstream most of the time. and you know, they keep coming upstream simply because, you know, they want to make sure that there are projects, because that's a very sensitive time where governments are mostly alone and they are failing to develop a project early. So what can be done? Perhaps, I think neutrality is very important here, that you have a neutral broker talking to the government at that stage. And I think that neutral broker doesn't or shouldn't have any investment interests in that project. Mm-hmm. So for me, a role played by the UN, for example, would be ideal, because the United Nations, as I mentioned earlier, will not invest in those projects. And I think that's a space for people to help a government until a certain point, and then pass on the project to the investors, and you know, just you know, disengage completely. That's the only way I see where there can be truly independence in the advice given to the governments, and continuity of the project. But you need, of course, the professionals to be involved. It's important that you have professionals involved in that space. One final thing, maybe digital transformation could be very useful there. So, for example, months and years are lost with intragovernmental, you know, back and forth. The Ministry of Finance talking to the Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Transport, and there is little accountability as to how long this advice should take. You know, should the Ministry of Finance sit on it for a year, for 6 months? I believe that if there is an IT platform that makes everything more accountable, and everything is logged, so there is full transparency, and there is no discussions of corruption, I think that would help to expedite that very sensitive part of the process. Another platform could be on stakeholder engagement, but that's also very delicate, and we also see that governments fail in their stakeholder engagement. So if you can democratize more stakeholder engagement through an IT platform, I think that would expedite, reduce the process, and I think make a contribution to better project.
Right. Okay. Well,
Louis,
go ahead,
if I
Jim.
could just interrupt, because I think that's
Please.
a very, very solid and great point. At Guggenheim, we created something called the Sustainable Quotient, which there's 4 quads, and the first one is talking about a financial return, which I think is very basic for all institutional investors attracting private capital. But then the other quadrants really rely on standards, or what we're talking about here, really fast and the labeling and so forth. And one of the quadrants remaining is transparency. It's really good government. And when you're looking to finance projects, whether it's in the emerging market or the development world, corruption and other items related to that are very, very critical to, bringing capital from North America to, the emerging markets, or honestly, even vice versa. The United States isn't immune to politicians making the wrong decision when building a toll road or an airport or whatnot. But I think when you're trying to finance projects globally, and ultimately, I think it's important to realize that infrastructure still is a local asset. It's not something that's going to impact the world in the day-to-day life, but it will eventually. That I think we really do need to make sure that the quadrants and the labeling and the standards analyze everything the best we can on a very universal platform, because ultimately it comes down to comparing an airport in Manila to an airport in Chicago. And how does an investor decide which one is more appropriate for a different type of risk or a different type of return? And I think as infrastructure goes global, in light of what the world needs, and now we're paying more attention to climate, nature-based solutions and so forth, we really have an opportunity here that one can compare airports or toll roads or schools, hospitals on a global basis, rather than just focusing on, well, this is what it is in New York versus what it's in London versus, another country or another city. So I do think that it's, things are changing, and the digital information age can definitely be very, very helpful for investors, developers, engineers, and so forth when we're trying to build, resilient infrastructure.
Right. Okay, so that's a very strong call from Tony for the independence of project preparation facilities, but also Jim, the transparency and the ability for us to transfer information in a standardized manner that really helps to clarify some of these issues. Speaks to the Fast Infra initiative, Finance to Accelerate the Sustainable Transition. We also just heard from Source in the previous session, and obviously the platform that we're creating here, the Future-Proof Infrastructure platform, and the pipeline of projects that we're creating, which is very, a granular example of how we're trying to, I guess, use technology to create that transparency. I can see you nodding along, Savina. What's on your mind at the moment?
I'm thinking, completely agree. And I think if we are also learning, from that sort of transparency and that sort of information sharing on a platform that is kind of neutral, that fosters, it's kind of good decision making, would really also benefit from the learning of when those projects actually get implemented, and what goes, how the construction stage, the O&M stage, what can go wrong, and learn from it, and in different parts of the world. I think the indicators and kind of the standards that are being established at the early stages of development of the infrastructure project, if a version of them carried through to later stages of development of the infrastructure project, it would be so good to actually learn and feedback the learning from how the project have been designed, built, operated, and maintained into then the early stages, and to kind of like continue to perfect and provide the evidence to then boost the confidence of the investors to, that feedback loop, right? So having, I suppose, having that sort of common understanding of what sustainable infrastructure is, which at the early stages translates into a set of indicators or a standard or a label, and then kind of carry that through to later stages of development and kind of create a feedback loop and have a platform that sort of enables you to access that information. That might be utopia. Right, okay. But, fantastic. But it's good to aim for the stars, right?
Yeah, but
we don't have time. We don't have time to be unambitious.
Absolutely. The next session is talking about the Fast Infra initiative, which, one of the initiatives under Fast is exactly that, to create an end-to-end platform that's backed up with a really solid sustainability label. So stay tuned for that. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to make it a contentious one, because I think that's always more interesting. We talk a lot about the finance gap to reach the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and we turn to the private sector to say, okay, this is where we're going to find this sort of quarter or third of the missing finance that's needed. What are the risks of us doing this? This is a question that I rarely hear asked or well answered. What are the risks of us taking public infrastructure, as an example, that's creating public services, and then inviting private sector engagement in that? Because this is ultimately what we're hoping to do. What kind of safeguards do we need in place to make that work properly? Maybe Savina, I'll pass it to you.
Well, yeah. So thank you, Louis. Well, obviously, we have this double imperative of ensuring financial sustainability while meeting, the societal objective with infrastructure. So sometimes things go wrong, you know, corruption and lack of transparency has been mentioned before. But things go wrong also. In the past, there's been examples of failed PPPs, I suppose, in the infrastructure sector that then gains bad publicity for this type of financing mechanism where the public and private sector collaborate. Just I'm thinking about maybe the Carillion bankruptcy in 2018. That here in the UK was such a shock, the second biggest construction company going bust, and then that had shockwaves in terms of implementing public and private sector partnership, but also sometimes entire projects and investment made by the private sector might get stuck, you know, conversely, due to changes in government policies. Sometimes the gestation period of a project can get significantly delayed by land acquisition, environmental issues, etc. So I think, you know, and so therefore the private investors that, you know, the private capital that we want to attract tends to then flow towards the less risky, less, I suppose, risky countries, etc., where there's less, obviously, corruption, more transparency, strong governance. So there is this risk, I think, you know, in involving the private sector sometimes is the lack of cooperation, collaboration, and the lack of understanding of the objectives of the infrastructure policies to be very well understood by the private partners, but also in terms of setting out good terms for verifiable infrastructure services to be provided to the public by the private partners on the basis of quite solid output on performance-based specifications. So that there are ways that this can be done, but, you know, there are also risks that it could not be going so well, and therefore, you know, doing a disservice to the type of collaboration.
Right. Okay. So getting that nitty-gritty right is crucially important. There's a lot of other topics that we could discuss, a lot of very interesting topics. We're reaching the end of our time, so what we'll do, we'll just have a quick final remark from each of the speakers. I'll start with you, Jim, if that's okay, and then Savita, and then Tony, and then we'll close it out.
Sure. I mean, I would say that for private capital to, you know, of size to participate in the global infrastructure deficit, it boils down to standards and measuring, you know, sustainability and making sure that everybody understands the different intangibles related to the project. And I think when I talk about sustainability, it's also, we have to be very careful on what that means. The definition is different around the globe, but I think ultimately is if there's standards that measure climate, nature-based solutions, ESG, and so forth, you know, private capital should flow. And I think that's what everybody's hopeful for. But until then, I think we're still, you know, looking for a standard or that label to make sure that investors around the world can understand that, you know, what is the sustainable metric or measurement for a project in Asia versus one in Latin America or whatnot.
Right. So efficiency, transparency, and interoperability.
And I think it's, yeah, profitability. I think that we can't avoid that one.
Profitability, right. Great. All right, Savina, some final remarks from your side.
Yeah, so I think to just build on what Jim is saying, I think we need to get better at assessing and evaluating those intangibles so that we can really make the case for the economic, social, environmental benefits of public infrastructure to kind of outweigh the cost of capital. I think we need to get better at that. We haven't really quite established like a recognized methodology that enables to do this at scale. And so I think you also, in terms of establishing the standards, the role of standards in doing this, but also establishing a line of sight of sustainability and resilience across the life cycle of infrastructure. That would be very helpful because it will break silo across all different stages of development and across all actors involved.
Right, and to ultimately make sure that the economic value of a project and the environmental social value of a project outweighs the cost of capital. Interesting.
Right.
Tony, final remark.
Thank you, Louis. Let me again wear the hat of a jury member and tell you a little bit some of the guiding principles that the jury has agreed going forward. In terms of sectors, I think you already mentioned them in your opening. We're talking about energy, renewable perhaps, transport, but also social infrastructure and natural disaster mitigation projects. I don't think that we have excluded any sector, but we are saying that this perhaps should be prioritized over others, although we are not excluding any project. I think it was said a little bit in the discussion about the impact of projects. We are looking at projects that have a positive impact. Not just a road that leads from A to B, but what is the transformation that road made for the local communities living in the region. In terms of finance structures, I think we are very interested in the blended finance structure, not just the public with the private, but also how different public money is being blended. I think that is something that was prioritized. And to conclude, of course, the early stage that was emphasized in this session and in the previous session, which perhaps the jury would like to also prioritize going forward.
Fantastic. That's a great summary. Thank you so much, Tony, for joining us here in the studio.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jim and Savina, for joining us online. I'll hand it back to our anchor now, Lorena.
Thank you so much, Louis, for moderating such a lively discussion. Thank you for our speakers for joining online and Tony for joining here in the studio. So we have heard much about early stage project preparation, the role of each actor in making sure that we really build the right projects from the beginning, in taking the right decisions that have to be taken, involving the right actors that have to be there in the room for making infrastructure that is future-proof. And now, I think it's time for a much-needed break. So I am happy to invite you to take stock of everything that we have discussed, to maybe grab a snack, and then meet us here in half an hour for our next session, where we will discuss about fast infra at 3 p.m. sharp. Thank you so much, and see you soon. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you have had a very nice break and some time to think about everything that we have learned in the first half of this event. So a small recap for those of you who are joining us after the break. So we have heard about the future-proof mission and vision that we have to come together as actors and key stakeholders to really build a sustainable future. We have heard about project preparation actors and the different tools that they have to enable this process. We also have heard about some experts regarding what they need to see in each of the projects and the role that standardization can play in this process. Now we will dive deeper into innovative funding and labeling mechanisms, a topic which is really close to my heart as standardization expert. GIB's goal is to accelerate the transition to a more sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And this is a goal that we share in this Congress, in the Future-Proof Infrastructure Congress and Platform. This vision that we have is also co-shared by another role in which GIB plays the role of Secretariat for the Fast Infra label. Working towards this shared mission and this, both with the FPI event and also being the Secretariat of the Fast Infra, is a way for us to really work towards this mission in a complementary way. Therefore, the following session will just talk about sustainable infrastructure as an asset class, a collaboration to drive investment through fast infra. And to moderate this session, I am pleased to welcome from the studio 𝐼𝐶 𝐼𝐶. 𝐼𝐶, she's Global Partnership Manager at GIB. And 𝐼𝐶 has worked in the area of international development in global institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and is an expert in strategic collaborations. 𝐼𝐶, welcome to the studio. How are we doing today?
Good, thank you, Lorena. How are you?
I'm very good. How have you found the discussion so far?
Very insightful.
Perfect. So, thank you, Arsha. The floor is yours.
Thank you once again, Lorena. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session on sustainable infrastructure as an asset class, collaboration to drive investment through the Fast Infra initiative. I would like to first welcome our speakers, Mr. James Pass and Mr. Robin Grenfell. James is a Senior Managing Director, Global Infrastructure and Project Finance Sector Manager and Portfolio Manager at Guggenheim Partners. He joined Guggenheim Partners in 2009 and is responsible for the research, development, and implementation of investment strategies for the firm's efforts in the infrastructure arena, including both equity and debt opportunities. He's also co-chair of the firm's Sustainable Stewardship Council, which reviews and oversees the firm's overarching sustainability strategy and execution. Robin is a senior manager in the Green Investment Group, GIG, Green Analytics team, which forms part of the Macquarie Asset Management Sustainability team. Robin joined GIG in 2018, and his role involves implementing GIG's green investment framework by evaluating the green impact of its investments. He represents Macquarie as the co-chair of Financial Services Task Force Working Group on Sustainable Finance under the Sustainable Markets Initiative. He's also the co-chair of the industry-led Sustainable Infrastructure Labeling Initiative under the Financing to Accelerate the Sustainable Transition Infrastructure, or FAST Infra. Welcome, Jim and Robin. It's really great to have you here. Robin, I would like to invite you actually to kick off this session with a keynote on the FAST Infra initiative as well as the Sustainable Infrastructure Label.
Thank you, Ajay. It's great to be here and part of this conversation. It's a really, really important conversation. So I'm going to say a few words about the Fast Infra Sustainable Infrastructure, or FISI label, what it is, how did we get to this point, which is after 2 years of development, it's now being taken on by the appointed Secretariat, GIB and Bloomberg. The two success factors I wanted to really stress were it being there being a common goal. That common goal was clear, ambitious, and realistic. The other is collaboration. It fostered cooperation and challenge, and I'll touch on each of those points. But first of all, what is the Fast Infra Sustainable Infrastructure, or FISI label? So it is a label that is linked to an infrastructure asset. It is independent of financing mechanism applicable across the development lifecycle. It defines sustainability across 4 dimensions of sustainability: environmental, social, governance, and together, adaptation and resilience. Within those dimensions, we have defined criteria that make up the positive and the baseline and the positive contribution requirements. And to attain the label, the asset must meet all baseline requirements and at least one of the positive contribution requirements. The methods and KPIs listed in the label are there demonstrate requirements, but they are illustrative. They're not prescriptive. And the asset must also meet a series of minimum safeguards and risk management approaches. And finally, to retain the label, there are also disclosure and reporting requirements, which are a key aspect. If you want to know more detail, of course, our colleagues at GIB are here to answer any questions you may have. But I did want to touch on those 2 key success factors. What's worked so far? How have we got to this point? And the point on common goal, I think, is so important. There was an objective to scale up private investment in sustainable infrastructure. There was a requirement to scale up private investment. Fast Infra was established with a very clear objective to accelerate financing towards sustainable infrastructure, addressing the investment gap, turning sustainable infrastructure into a deep and liquid asset class. The label was identified as a key initiative to provide common language as to what constitutes sustainable infrastructure. And we needed this because the market needs to attract private investors to quality, sustainable infrastructure projects. We often hear that there is enough money out there to bridge the funding gap, that there's a need for investable projects. And as every week goes by, more investors, more organizations are making commitments to make sustainable investments. Regulations are coming out to demand transparency of those commitments and claims. So the label was seen as a crucial way to accelerate due diligence, facilitate structuring of investments, but also facilitate reporting under various frameworks. It was designed with multiple frameworks in mind, so it's not an additional burden, but with well-structured evidence, it will make disclosure easier by the company, by its financial backers. And whilst the goal was to have a globally applicable, we had to appreciate the context of emerging and developing economies. So including that flexibility and ease of adoption was key. And in terms of the common goal and the key tenets of the label, there were four which I really wanted to call out. One was definition. So providing that clarity, that coherence to the market. These criteria beneath the four dimensions provide that definition of sustainable investment. Recognition and compatibility. So not inventing new, but building on current practice. IFC performance standards are globally recognized. We need to leverage them, but with positive contribution pulling from best practice. The third is flexibility, allowing users of the SI label to select the appropriate method for demonstrating alignment. And finally, transparency. The counterpoint to flexibility is transparency, allowing users to select the method appropriate for them, for the infrastructure, for the context, but giving investors the ability to scrutinize and align with their stated objectives and standards. So with that common goal, we were able to strive to see more well-structured projects to attract investment, and in turn see rising standards across the development and infrastructure globally. The last point, the second key success factor was collaboration. This was a finance industry-led, but private-public partnership, broad-based, open and inclusive, broad range of private-public finance institutions, experts in the sustainability field, from the third sector, civil society. We also had a technical working group gathering best practice from across the globe. And that fostered active debate on high standards and also practical application. And that was born from experience to make something that was going to be effective. So we had this cooperation toward the common goal. We had the right people in the group fostering that right amount of challenge and focus on solutions. We had debates as to the definitions and requirements of the label, which ultimately has led to a solution that's effective and practical. That was then backed up by a series of consultation exercises. We had roundtables, engaging experts in the industry, practitioners, and then it went out to public consultation some time ago now. And the final point is around the endorsements. So we engaged with leaders in the industry to get endorsements from credible parties to give that credence and credibility. That includes Global Infrastructure Facility, GIF, Investor Leadership Network, ILN, Glasgow Financial Alliance, the Net Zero, GFANS, Task Forces on the Sustainable Markets Initiative, SMI, Long-Term Infrastructure Investor Association, LTIIA, and Local Governments for Sustainability, 𝐏𝐫𝐬𝐬𝐿. But now it's over to the Secretariat. Work with these organisations to accelerate the label's adoption. So that's my last point. I think now we just watch this momentum build. The support's there from significant parts of the sustainable finance community. So now's the time to build that momentum, and I'm very excited to see how that happens.
Thank you, Robin. Indeed, that was a very good description about the fast infra and the upcoming work that we are doing on the label. And definitely it would give different stakeholders of this label, from project developers to investors, the confidence, as they invest in these projects together to achieve net zero. So my question now is to you, Jim. As we're talking about sustainable infrastructure, how do you think this fast infra initiative supports the definition of sustainable infrastructure as a unique asset class?
Well, first of all, thank you, and Robin, that was very, very helpful, and congratulations on where it was 2 years ago and where it is today. In many ways, the effort of FAST has really followed a lot of the reports that Guggenheim has sponsored, working with GIB as well as the WWF and KPMG. Is that we've seen that the standards, really are across the map. They have definitely diverged, and I would hope that with now FAST where it is today and with the Secretariat, maybe there'll be a convergence of standards into one that would be accepted globally or really would be applied from institutional investors regardless of their location. When we talk about infrastructure and the definition of sustainable infrastructure in particular, standards are critical because ultimately that is how institutions like Guggenheim Partners and our clients or Macquarie and across the globe, can measure and be really rewarded for their performance, not just from a financial perspective, but also from a sustainability perspective. And I think as we go through the adoption and, really applying, this standard, to really see what it does and really how does it measure, 3 years, 5 years down the road. I think that's really probably going to be the key, because financial performance does change over time, and I think sustainability standards will evolve as well. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that we see, is that based on a recent survey that we sponsored with KPMG, we asked a lot of data users and the input of data to define sustainability at their level. And one of the surprising observations, which I think FAST will help us with, is really what is the definition and what is the role of government. And in many ways, it somewhat was counterintuitive that the private sector was leaning on government. And now with Robin's kind of call to action by trying to get the adopters to be supportive, I think maybe that will alleviate that one concern. But in the end of the day, sustainable infrastructure is something that is built, something that is essential, but really considers nature-based solutions, ESG, the sustainable goals, but also is, takes into consideration financial expectations. I don't think we can leave that piece of the puzzle off the table.
Absolutely. But also, Jim, just to go back to the question, because I think a lot of this is, the initiative is great for project developers, especially, as you said, among all these different standards to find a common language, but also for investors, how does this initiative labeling infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure as a unique asset class, how do you think this can facilitate more investment?
Well, if there's a standard that can be applied to measure the effectiveness or the, really the sustainability nature of an investment, I mean, ultimately, investment managers, institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds can measure the financial performance using, well-tested models and so forth. And to get private capital to be invested in an asset class where sustainability is in the title, we need to have a measurement so we can demonstrate to our clients that, hey, this may have an 8% return, but on a sustainability scale, it has blank. And so I think FAST will definitely be accelerate more interest and more currency into those type of asset classes. You can always have lenders on the debt side pursue green bonds and so forth. Really, the challenge globally is how do we get investors to participate as an owner, as an equity provider? And I think that's really where the benefit of FAST will be seen probably immediately, as long as it gets adopted and investors truly understand the metrics or the components, whether it's in the United States or Asia or Europe or whatnot. So ultimately, it boils down to education. Making sure that investors understand that there is a metrics that one could use and going forward.
Absolutely, and also while we're on this topic with United States, you know, we see sustainable investing is more accepted in, for example, in Europe with asset managers and investors than in North America, especially considering the recent political backlash against ESG investing. How do you think, and to which extent could, you know, a label like this FISI label, the Sustainable Infrastructure Label, represent a quality stamp for investors' ESG due diligence processes?
It's a great question, and it's early in the US, so it'll be a rough day if that's my second question. But no, I would say that, you know, in Europe and the rest of the world, people are asking how to invest in sustainable assets, or what is. In the United States, we're still asking why. And why is, you know, infrastructure is local, projects are local, and, you know, we rely, you know, very significantly on the municipal market. And so that, right, by definition, involves government at the state, the county, and the local level. And, you know, I think what we're dealing with today, with kind of going right to your question, you know, it's a challenge. You know, investments themselves have to stand on their own 2 feet. And I think that's ultimately really what, you know, some of the backlash may be, you know, focus on. But obviously the pendulum is swinging rather wide. There's not a middle ground as of yet. But between, you know, the federal initiative at the Blue Dot program to some of the significant, you know, climate events that we've had in North America repeatedly, you know, there will be greater emphasis. But, you know, the United States is still, you know, we're asking that question why. And I think standards like this and demonstration will be very critical to, you know, to influence and to get more sustainable projects, or lack of a better word, to get more projects financed in a sustainable manner.
Right. Thank you, Jim. Robin, I would like to ask you regarding what we just talked about, you know, considering these many and varying standards and taxonomies that even project developers have to report on, how do you think the FAST Infra label can facilitate investment in sustainable infrastructure assets, you know, among these, navigating through these various standards and taxonomies?
Yeah, I mean, that was a key question that came up very early on when we were discussing why are we working on this? Why do we need what for all intents and purposes some saw as another standard? But really, what we were trying to do is have something that worked within the sea of standards. We were not trying to reinvent the wheel. We said there's a lot of good work out there, a lot of good practice around how to show you know, certain sustainability attributes. And so the flexibility that was designed in was to allow just that, to say, what is the most appropriate method to demonstrate climate mitigation or resilience at a certain point with a certain asset in a certain jurisdiction. Having that flexibility we saw was absolutely key. Now, I fully agree with Jim's sentiment that we want convergence on standards. That's what I think that will ultimately be the goal. But we're not there yet, and we need something to work now. Yeah. And I think that's what the label can do. It can provide that framework, provide the flexibility to use the relevant, the appropriate method. And as I mentioned in my notes earlier, around the transparency back up to that. Mm-hmm. So just disclosing, being clear on which methods have been used will enable scrutiny from the market, but also alignment of interests for the investor. So an investor can, there's a stated objective mandate to contribute positively to a certain element, maybe the social, maybe the environmental goal, but also which standards are acceptable. Mm-hmm. So the investor can immediately look for that. So that's a key point around working within a sea of standards. And then structuring the information, I think I mentioned this as well, structuring the information will facilitate reporting. It does require good structure of data, information, and that's where GRB and Bloomberg, I know, will be focusing a lot of effort around structuring the disclosures so that that can then be used to report against SFDR requirements, for example. A lot of this information is collected as standard. It really is in terms of diligence. It's good preparation to focus on these aspects when preparing a project, when raising financing. So I think that's something which emerged over time as we saw that that was going to help investors to report, which is again another big why, encouraging investors to why to get behind this.
And also, you know, we see, I mean, collaboration is really at the heart of, you know, this initiative. And we've talked about why private sector should be part of this, why investors should invest. And we also have the French and the Singapore government endorse the initiative, but we are yet to see support from other governments. So why do you think governments should join an investment initiative like the Fast Infra?
Well, I think there's a number of good reasons. One is to express their own views in terms of how they believe sustainability should be framed. But fundamentally, it's about accelerating that investment. And if they can use this as a tool to accelerate investment in their jurisdictions, to address that funding gap, it seems like a fantastic forum to do so. So I think that's it really. Getting their voices at the table will allow them to partake in that discussion, but also really adopting it, encouraging developers in their jurisdiction to use these principles in their project preparation will ultimately help attract more private financing.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I guess also to add to that, achieve their own sustainable development goals, whatever the targets are according to the country. I just want to see if we have any questions from the audience.
Yes, are there any specific region the label will target?
Sorry, Ashley, would it be possible to repeat the question? If you could repeat the question.
Yes. Are there any regions the label will target?
And I think I'll very much leave that for my GIB colleagues to focus on the rollout plan. But I would say that it is globally applicable. That's also that. But there may well be a targeted rollout plan. But I'll certainly defer to my GIB colleagues on that.
Right.
And if I may just add one point, I mean, I think that's a very critical component. You know, from an investor's perspective, I think it's important that projects, regardless where they are, use the same standard, the same metrics. And I think, you know, accounting standards really do give us a good roadmap on how a standard like this can be rolled out or a label can be rolled out. In many ways, when capital flows, you know, investors, regardless of where they are, they're very comfortable with the financial statements one sees and one reviews. And so I think if we're looking to understand fast, a project in Indonesia compared to a project in Latin America, you know, in Europe and so forth, needs to have some type of common characteristic. So investors, wherever they may be, can make that you know, financial judgment on how to deploy their capital. And that also, I think, applies to industry as well. We can't have different labels for different types of projects. There may be different components within the label that may be applicable, but ultimately the more common standards we use and the common questions will be much more effective for financing sustainable infrastructure on a global basis. And yes, that's very, very ambitious and maybe somewhat of an unrealistic goal right now. But I think as more people understand what FAST is and apply that to projects, I think we'll see, you know, definitely the convergence of those questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. Do we have any other questions?
How do you envisage the label's global uptake and scale?
The global uptake and scale. Yeah, I mean, to be ambitious, we want huge uptake and scale. This is the scalability was a key requirement. You know, there's such a huge funding gap we need to address. If it's going to make a difference, it needs to scale. Again, I will pass the buck a little bit to my secretariat colleagues to set that ambition. But for this to be effective, it has to be globally applicable, and it has to scale rapidly.
Yeah. Jim, did you want to say something? Oh.
No, I would
sorry.
agree.
Okay.
I mean, nothing to add. I mean, there's a lot of questions popping up. I'm seeing on the chat, which is great.
Yeah. Patrick, any more questions?
Yes, just one more. Do you see a risk that the current monetary policy paradigm of the EU and US central banks that fight in rising interest rates and pressures to cool down the economy can slow down investment flows in low carbon infrastructure assets?
I can take a crack at that, and unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. I think people are trying to identify, we're trying to redefine the risk premium. It's still early, but we've seen a lot of shocks to the global system. What happened in Europe last week with Switzerland and some of the challenges we're having in the United States just on bank and bank deposits, and what that means and how that reacts to interest rates, as well as I think the other aspect of what's going on are really a subsidy battle, between what the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States could do for renewable projects and so forth, and how that may attract capital into the United States away from the rest of the world. But infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure in particular, I would say the momentum grew during COVID, which was a global crisis, and we were not put on the back burner in many ways. I think sustainability kind of became even more important. Mm-hmm. It's definitely broadened the definition today with climate-based solutions or nature-based solutions. So I think it's one of the real-world problems that we have to acknowledge and realize that returns are important to attract capital. But ultimately, the intangible here to attract capital, the private capital in particular, is a label or is a standard, and I think FAST solves that. And so I think this financial situation will pass eventually, and as a result of that, FAST will be in a position to enhance and accelerate development infrastructure dollars around the world.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I think we have come towards the end of this session. Thank you very much for joining in today and for this very informative session. Thank you, both of you. And I would like to give the floor back to my colleague, Lorena.
Thank you so much, Arsha, for that lively discussion. And thank you, Robin and Jim, for joining on the standardization. My standardization heart is singing. Love how the discussion is picking up. So thank you, Arsha. And I think it's time now for our next session. And we have heard now about labeling mechanisms. We have heard about a curation process. We have heard how crucial this is and how convergence on standardization is needed. And now we will dive deeper into blended finance and public-private partnerships and how they facilitate investment in infrastructure. To moderate this panel, I am really pleased to introduce Jean-Christophe Barth, also known as JC. JC is Executive Director of the World Association of Public-Private Partnerships Units and Professionals. JC is an international deal mediator with over 2 decades of experience in banking, legal affairs, and complex long-term infrastructure contracts. JC, I see you now on the screen. Very happy to have you with us. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm joining you from Addis Ababa from a high-level policy dialogue on PPPs. So it's very timely, and I'm happy to share a bit of time with you in Basel or wherever you are.
Perfect. Thank you so much, JC. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So yeah, it's a pleasure for me to moderate this interesting panel today that has been framed Debt and Equity in the Context of Inflation, PPPs, Blended Finance, and the Past End-to-End Platform, with such exceptional group of experts that I will introduce to you one after another. My name is Jean-Christophe Barth, and alongside my role as Executive Director of WAP, I also work as a deal mediator, which means I seek mutual value in, for example, public-private partnership deals. This is particularly important because very often the negotiation time between the public and private entities is very limited. And unfortunately, we don't work enough on the relationship and maintaining it over a very long period of time. And this is why I believe we need to really focus on that space. The first panelist I would like to introduce to you, I don't know if François is with us, is François Bergère. He's the Secretary General of the Long-Term Infrastructure Investors Association. Is he with us? Okay, he's just being added. Well, while we're adding François, maybe let me say something about WAP. WAP is the global home of PPP professionals with over 350 members in over 50 country PPP units, and we're harnessing the power of a global network for better public-private partnerships that are next level, as we call them, so that are focusing on SDG-driven PPPs, and also that makes sure that climate resilience is part of the exercise. I see that François has joined us now. So François Bergère is the Secretary General of the Long-Term Infrastructure Investors Association. François has a long professional experience in the field of public management, project and infrastructure finance, having worked, for example, as the manager of the multinational investment funds in infrastructure, and before that in the PF, and also with the French Ministry of Finance to set up and manage the PPP task force before joining the World Bank, as I said, with the Public-Private Investment Advisory Facility to foster an investment-enabling environment for private sector in infrastructure. He has a background in management studies with diplomas from HEC Paris and from the French École Nationale d'Administration, ENA. He lectures project finance and PPPs at Sciences Po and at l'École des Ponts et Chaussées, I think, right? Paris Tech. Maybe, François, the floor is yours to present LTIIA, this interesting organization that is also a WAP member.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. So just a few words about the Long-Term Infrastructure Investor Association. So LTIIA, as it's known, is an international association convening 40-odd members, both asset owners, limited partners, as we call them, or fund managers, general partners, specializing in infrastructure, as well as some service providers and advisors. Those investors are mostly active in the equity segment, even though now we've seen more and more of our JP members active in the debt segment as well. What sort of unites our members is the shared DNA, this sort of long-term view about a long-term horizon being that the best way to effectively create and sustain value over time, over the life cycle of a project. And in that way, I believe from the very beginning, we were closely aligned with the whole concept of sustainable infrastructure development. Another characteristic feature is that almost all our investors are based in the OECD, in developed countries, and the vast majority of them do invest in developed economies, developed market, investment grade markets. So that's an issue we may come back to later on when speaking on how to attract and scale up private investment in emerging economies in view of the sort of pending challenges. Basically, this is due to some kind of a risk aversion or strict definition of the fiduciary duty, in particular for institutional investors like pension funds, but something we need to better address and dissipate maybe some biases or preconception if we are to extend and scale up private investment in emerging economies. And what we do is we try to engage with public and private stakeholders with the investing community at large to effectively sustain and scale up and channel increased flows of capital, both equity and debt, to the sustainable infrastructure category, and in the process, sort of mainstream or transform unlisted sustainable infrastructure in a full-fledged asset class. And just to give you an idea, so altogether our members manage around 350 billion assets under management in infrastructure as sort of a consolidated amount. Now, a few words about our goals. So as any professional association, we try to promote the interest of our members. That's called lobbying or public advocacy, as we rather say. But it's mostly by sharing or conveying the expectations, constraints, or perspectives of the investing community to the decision makers, whether the policymakers, regulators, procuring authorities, and sort of sharing the knowledge about what are the most effective drivers or the main challenges or constraints in that respect. So informing, in a way, the public sector about drivers for private infrastructure investment, and of course, the other way around as well. It goes both ways. And that's being helped by the fact that I believe our association is recognized as a legitimate voice to effectively reflect the views of this investor community. We do have a number of cross-membership agreement or cooperation relationship with public decision makers, public investors. D20 LTIC is a case in point, but we also work with the Global Infra Hub, a number of multilaterals or other development banks. And we also see ourselves as content producers. We're sharing and disseminating best practices, handbooks, and promoting, again, standards, methodologies, and tools to achieve that goal, hence our early support and participation in the Fast Infra initiative. And I'll stop here. Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you very much, Francois. And without further ado, let's move to Enrico Petrocelli, who's joining us.
Indeed, sorry, I'm late. My internet connection from India crashed just 1 minute before the beginning of the panel. Sorry.
Well, we're very happy that you joined us.
Yeah,
but there seems to be an echo. So Enrico is the Secretary General of the D20 Long-Term Investors Club and the head of international institutional relations at Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, the CDP in Rome. He has a degree in political science and has formerly been a policy advisor for foreign policy instruments at the European Commission and head of the private office of the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs and the president of the Italy delegation to NATO. So very diverse experiences, and I think that's really beautiful to have you with us here. Maybe you can give us a short presentation of the goals of LTIC.
Indeed, thank you so much, and once again, sorry for being late. And it's a pleasure being here today. Thanks for having me, and congratulations for the organization of such a great event, Future-Proof Infrastructure event. So also thanks to Global Infrastructure Basel for having us, the D20 Long-Term Investors Club. As I was saying, I'm currently participating on behalf of the D20 LTSC to the G20 Infrastructure Working Group here in India, because the D20 Long-Term Investors Club, which comprised 23 leading financial institutions with public mandate from the world's largest economies, is seeking to contribute since a while, for several years, to the G20 overall effort to bring forward the global agenda of infrastructure investments. In this regard, particularly the G20 long-term investors club in the last 2 years have supported the various G20 work streams on private sector participation to infrastructure investments, and co-organized in the last couple of years, 2021, 2022, together with the G20 presidency, the OECD, the G20 Infrastructure Investors Dialogue, which has been the most high-level fora for dialogue between the G20 national governments, financial institutions, and private sector. Alongside the work with the Italian and G20 presidents in the last couple of years, we engage as the D20 LTSC also with other key partners, international organizations and international network of financial institutions, starting with the Finance in Common, a global infrastructure facility from I see here colleagues from GIF, G20 engagement groups such as T20 and B20, the Global Infrastructure Hub, and the OECD. And as I was mentioning, I'm here today in India, joining once again the G20 official meetings, and we just had a quite important discussion about the upcoming third edition of the G20 Infrastructure Investors Dialogue, which will be hosted by India next July. So very keen to contribute to bringing forward the global agenda on infrastructure investment. I stop here, and maybe we can come back later on for more substantial comments. Thanks.
Many thanks, Enrico. I have now the pleasure to introduce Carmel Lev to you. She's a program officer at the Global Infrastructure Facility, which is hosted within the World Bank Group, an infrastructure project preparation facility established in 2014 as a G20 initiative to address the lack of bankable pipelines of sustainable quality infrastructure investment opportunities that are attractive to private capital. Previous to her role at the GIF, Carmel brings experience at the intersection of international development and finance, holding positions at the International Finance Corporation, IFC, Impact Investment Exchange, and National Democratic Institute. Carmel holds a BA in Global Studies, World Arts and Cultures, and a Master of Science in Foreign Service, Global Business and Finance. Carmel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe, and really a pleasure to connect with everyone. And just building off of the kind introduction, just a bit about the GIF. We are indeed housed at the World Bank, but we are a project preparation facility that provides equal access funding and technical assistance to a network of 10 MDB partners. And this is achieved through the generous support of our 8 donors. And through those contributions, we've been able to amass a global portfolio of 160 infrastructure activities in about 68 countries, really spanning all of the core infrastructure sectors around renewable energy, sustainable transport, social infrastructure, ICT, water, wastewater, solid waste. And we do have a concrete mission about mobilizing private capital. So we do provide end-to-end support, really from the earliest project conceptualization and pre-feasibility studies all the way to commercial and financial close. And to date, 19 of our projects have achieved close, and that has mobilized $9 billion in private sector capital. So this is something, a key mission of our work. And as Enrico had pointed out too, we are also a part of the G20 Infrastructure Working Group, have a role advancing G7 principles, and that is kind of key to our work.
I was just going to query you on the connection precisely to that.
Indeed. And I think it's an important kind of second aspect to our work. We, in addition to being a project preparation facility, we really do serve as a global collaboration platform. So we do have a network of around 60 leading institutional investors, commercial banks, development finance institutions that make up our network. And we also lead on a lot of strategic initiatives in the sustainable infrastructure ecosystem, one of which is Fast Infra, which was discussed by my colleague, Robin Grenfell, in the previous sessions. So I won't go into too much detail here, but this is just a key aspect of the work that we've led since the inception of Fast Infra alongside HSBC and Macquarie and helping to kind of bring the label to fruition. But I'm happy to kind of provide a little bit more details about that in the second round of interventions. So I'll pass it back to you, Jean-Christophe.
Thank you very much. So maybe, I mean, I'd be very interested to hear about what you're thinking on the latest trends in terms of PPPs. I'm happy to start off with that. I mentioned earlier the next level PPP to look at public-private partnerships, not just as a tool for procurement, but actually as a tool for development. I think that's a really important mindset shift that needs to be undertaken there. I can tell you first source how the situation is here with the Economic Commission in Africa on all these grand strategies to develop and bring infrastructure that is available to civil society, the PIDA corridor. I mean, it's amazing, all the ideas that are out there. But there's still a huge gap in terms of capacity building. Many investors are agnostic about PPPs and are really focusing on robust constructual frameworks. And what matters at the end of the day is that we are able to deliver a pipeline of very long-term projects that are able to deliver on the objectives of that. And that's not so easy because the national action plans vary from what I see. And what we need is to provide transitional blended finance mechanisms that are able to meet these objectives. And I think like pension funds certainly play a role, and maybe Francois, you can speak about that in the context of long-term infrastructure investors. You're muted. Francois, you're still muted.
All right, yeah, so indeed, there's been a lot of public debate and literature and often hot and controversial arguments about PPPs, that the border between public and private is still very sensitive in many jurisdictions. As you say, most of investors, and certainly our investors at LTRA, are broadly agnostic about which form of private sector participation is effectively used as long as it meets certain key criteria in terms of risk, in particular, risk mitigation and sustainability. What can be said in favor of PPPs, I would say, is that it offers indeed a well-tested framework, one which includes a wealth of experience, if only over the last 20, 25 years. It's been sometimes subject to political controversies, but then infrastructure is inherently political. I mean, I don't know of any big infrastructure project that is not. And indeed, it can offer a well-tested way to sort of fine-tune and achieve that kind of balance that institutional investors are looking for. And in the case of pension funds that you mentioned, this is definitely a low-level risk and return equilibrium that they're seeking. I mean, for them, it's just unenvisionable that they could come back to their, potential beneficiaries and say, okay, we've lost part of the capital in investing in a risky, unlisted alternative asset infrastructure project. There's just no way it's going to fly. So it's really about finding the right level of risk and return through risk mitigation, through incorporating sustainability early on, and thus mitigating both financial risk and non-financial risk, reputational risk when it comes to sustainable infrastructure as well. One final word is that many of our investors are now sort of appropriating the so-called universal owner approach, which means that they, well, provided they're big enough, they see themselves as owning a small slice of the global economy and society. And henceforth, they see themselves as being responsible as well for the ongoing health of the economy and society. And for that reason, sustainable infrastructure, and presumably through some kind of enhanced and appropriate PPP approach, is to be and remain a significant, I wouldn't say preferred channel for channeling their investment. Thank you.
I'd like for us to quickly zoom out and take maybe a macro perspective on public-private partnerships. If we look at the amount, the percentage of public finance that goes into PPP infrastructure, it's only 5%. And then if we take a deeper look at that and see that almost 80% of all infrastructure projects that are intended to become a PPP are actually aborted, we have to start asking ourselves questions, because this is a huge cost of planning projects and having to abort them. So let's make sure that at least the 20% that are left in the pipeline that are managed or bankable and get financed are executed to the best, practices of our industry. And even for them, unfortunately, the World Bank statistics that we see, they're not very, encouraging, because after a couple of years only, for projects that are designed to last for decades, they get renegotiated. So I'd like to know from Enrico, from the G20 gathering, how are you addressing that challenge of having to deal with this high rate of aborted projects? What are the specific measures that you're trying to undertake to counter that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jean-Christophe. I have to say, as a D20, first of all, I want to echo very much what Francois just said. Francois and LTIA actually are a member of key member of the D20 LTSC. So we really share same views on this topic. But let me stress that from our perspective, we value very much, and we insist in underlining very much the catalyzing role our financial institutions, long-term investors can play in bridging infrastructure investment gaps, and also in bringing together public and private players and mobilizing together public and private resources. In this regard, we value very much blended finance instruments. We advocate very much for broader use of blended finance instrument as one of the most useful tools to increase infrastructure investments, especially in order to bring in private sector, and especially in emerging economies. Allocating more resources to blended finance tools, including through multilateral national development banks we represent, would allow actually organizations to invest, lend, or provide guarantees alongside each other while achieving their own objectives. And these objectives includes, has been already mentioned, remunerating capital, increasing the environmental and social outcomes. Such an endorsement will help mobilize private sector financing towards public and private partnerships by mitigating investment risks and balancing risk-reward profiles of projects, thus leveraging limited pools of public or concessional funds, especially in cases when projects' marginal benefits to society are greater than its marginal costs. So, having said that, we think also that pure financial support is not sufficient, as the collaboration between public and private stakeholders should be wider, start earlier on to improve the overall investment climate. And in this regard, I think designing bankable projects remain, has been already said, one of the biggest hurdles when attracting investments in sustainable infrastructure and building lasting PPP structures. The project preparation stage determines the ability to invest in an infrastructure project, and there is a need to improve project preparation capability, especially in emerging and developing economies. Channeling more resources to project preparation facilities, in our perspective, would allow for both technical support and funding in this important project stage. So we definitely advocate, but also we try to take very concrete action in this regard, try to support project preparation facility, and try to work very much and focus on the upstream of the long-term investments in infrastructure. We indeed strongly believe in using proficiently public-private partnerships to close the global infrastructure investment gap now present. And in this regard, we trying to bring this this perspective and also the specific set of proposals in the G20 framework. I think some progress has been made in the last months in the G20 framework. We just had a quite encouraging discussion on the specific work to foster investments in infrastructure in urban and in cities environment and also on quality infrastructure investment indicators. There is a push from G20 presidency to work on its implementation. We know that these are still a non-binding voluntary set of indicators, but I see some positive willingness from several G20 countries to engage in a more constructive way, also in order to define a more clear set of common agreed standards. This obviously it's a different topic. I think it will help in also facilitating mobilization of private capital on top of public funds in long-term infrastructure investments.
Thank you, Enrico. With the remaining time, I'd like to ask both Carmel and François to maybe give us a better understanding on the sequence of events and the rollout of the Fast Infra label end-to-end platform and what the ambition is so that we can have appetite for the future.
Great, thanks, Jean-Christophe. And just very quickly, I did want to echo François and Enrico's point on just the need to, at least on PPPs, to really think also upstream and midstream on how do you develop bankable pipelines, and GIF has kind of a key hand in this, and we're also thinking a lot about innovative forms of design and structuring of projects, ones that kind of promote programmatic approaches, can standardize contracts, help to lessen transaction costs, and make this much more favorable to the private sector as they're looking to invest. But in the interest of time, I'll just kind of skip ahead to Fast Infra and not to repeat too much from Robin, since he did highlight many of these points in the previous session. But in terms of kind of concrete next steps where we are on the label, we had selected Global Infrastructure Basel and Bloomberg as the secretariat and data reporting repository for the label. This was announced at COP27 back in November. And now they're in the process of kind of helping to operationalize the label and build out the data platform that will help to kind of transparently disclose projects that choose to either self-declare or be certified by an external verifier for their SI label projects, and help to really crucially drum up support from stakeholder groups across the public and private and multilateral sectors to make this a really sustainable label that has broad endorsement. And I did want to speak just very briefly to another work stream as part of the broader Fast Infra initiative, which is the tech-enabled platform, what's being called Fast Infra Platform. This is the prototype was also unveiled at COP27, but this will serve as more of a platform to better connect the industry, providing really robust data on infrastructure transaction with the ultimate goal of really increasing the number of bankable projects financed across the infrastructure life cycle, providing value both for governments looking for improved terms to procure quality infrastructure services, but also for investors who are looking to find that deal flow to deploy their capital. So this is very much a work in progress, but let me, in the remaining minute, turn it over to François on where we go from here. Thanks.
Thank you, Carmel. And indeed, taking over and complementing what both Robin in the previous session and Carmel just said about the platform and the platform, just like to highlight the fact that we're still working on operationalizing the TopCo, the holding company, Fast Infra Group, in terms of budget, staffing, internal governance, and so on. A work in progress, and full disclosure, I'm being associated with that work. And at the same time, we also keep in mind, even though it would come further down the road, a third dimension of the Fast Infra initiative, and one that has also the potential to be a game changer if and when it effectively materializes, And I'm referring to the innovative financing dimension, whether it's sort of rolling out a global renewable energy guarantee sort of platform, or developing open source managed co-lending portfolio program, a bit like or replicating what has been pioneered by IFC, or setting up a sustainable financing facility to facilitate, streamline financing and refinancing for this sustainable infrastructure asset class. So in other words, delivering the mainstreaming and liquidity and bankability that are sought by the initiative as one of its main target and goals. So still a work in progress, but definitely there on the horizon as the next steps that we ambition to roll out in the coming years.
Let me give the word back to Lorena. Thank you very much also Nathalie Gaulier and Pedro Nunez for having prepared that with us. And I'm happy now to hand over to my colleague in Geneva, Mr. Rowan.
Thank you very much, JC, and to all our wonderful speakers. That was very exciting and a lot of food for thought. And it's a perfect link to our next session, which will take us to the next level and zero down on specific types of projects. I'm talking about how we can understand how early stage preparation can support the creation of nature-based solutions projects. I am pleased to invite to moderate this panel virtually, Rowan Palmer. Rowan is lead for the Sustainable Infrastructure Investment Team at the United Nations Environment Programme. Rowan is an expert on building capacity for system-level sustainable infrastructure development. As well, I am pleased to invite here in the studio two of the speakers joining this panel. So please, 𝐼𝐼 and also Michael Kapetanakis, please join me here on stage. How are you doing?
Very well, very well.
All good. Have you been following the sessions?
Of course.
Perfect. So Rowan, how are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
All good. So, well, without further ado, I will pass on to you, Rowan, to guide us through this session. You have the floor.
Great. Thanks very much, Lorena, and welcome to everybody joining online. As Lorena mentioned, in this session, we're going to talk about nature-based infrastructure solutions, or NBI for short. For those who might be unfamiliar with this term, NBI are a type of nature-based solution that involves the use of natural or nature-based infrastructure. And here we're talking about landscapes, ecosystems, or elements thereof to deliver infrastructure services either by substituting or complementing service delivery by conventional so-called gray infrastructure. Some of the services typically delivered by NBI can include water quality and provision, coastal protection, heating and cooling, but there are many more. And at UNEP, we've been working with researchers at the University of Oxford to assess the potential contribution of NBI in 8 sectors to the SDG targets. And we find that in each of the 8 sectors, integrating NBI into infrastructure along with conventional gray solutions to deliver services in that sector can increase the number of SDG targets that are positively influenced by up to 62% when compared with using gray infrastructure alone. This is because NBI deliver multiple additional benefits beyond just the primary intended service. So, for example, if we think about preserving or restoring a watershed as an NBI solution that provides clean drinking water for a community, that's the primary intended service, and it's directly contributing to SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation. And at the same time, that healthy ecosystem is providing a host of other services and benefits, so things like carbon sequestration, air purification, soil stabilization, recreational value, etc. And these are also contributing to other SDG targets under SDGs, for example, SDG 13 on climate action or SDG 15 on life on land. So the point is that NBI, with its contribution of this ability to sustainably deliver some infrastructure services, as well as these multiple additional benefits can be a really powerful tool for working towards sustainable development. However, there are several challenges to implementing NBI at scale. These include a lack of financing models, need for building capacity to identify and consider potential NBI solutions early on as part of infrastructure planning, and uncertainty over long-term performance and costs and benefits of NBI. And so the purpose of today's session is really to try and understand some of these challenges better and how we can address them to try and unlock more opportunities for implementing NBI at scale. And to do that, we're going to hear from 3 distinguished panelists, all of whom have extensive experience working on NBI. First, we have 𝐏𝐬𝐿-𝐾𝐫𝐿 from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. 𝐏𝐬𝐿 is a research analyst who works on valuations of sustainable infrastructure, including nature-based infrastructure solutions in the urban context, among other things. And prior to joining IISD, he was an economic consultant at Arup, where he developed economic assessment models for large-scale transport projects, as well as flood risk assessments for other types of infrastructure. Next, we have Uri Jurek from Global Infrastructure Basel. Uri is responsible for a set of projects that aim at enhancing ecosystem services and natural capital, including nature-based solutions to mitigate impacts of river flooding. He previously worked with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in Geneva on strengthening the business case for private sector investment in natural infrastructure. And then finally, we have Rob Cunningham from the Nature Conservancy. And Rob is TNC's Resilient Watershed Program Director for Europe, a role that involves developing programs that deliver NBS at scale to address water security issues faced by communities, utilities, businesses. And Rob's background is rooted in water quality and water resource management. He's also worked for NGOs, regulators, and utilities, but always with a focus on how nature-based solutions can be deployed for the benefit of people and biodiversity. And so I'm going to start with my first question to Rob. Rob, in your extensive experience implementing NBI on the ground, what have been some of the key barriers to scaling up their use, and what are some things we might do to address them?
Thanks, Rowan. Thanks, everyone. Thinking about kind of early stage preparation and the importance of that, and reflecting on this theme. So I've kind of both been promoting NBS from the outside of business and evaluating their applicability within. And kind of my observations are that for those people who are proposing NBS from the outside of it, industry, NGOs, community groups, quite often they've got a really deep understanding of the environment, the pressures they're facing the environment, and some of the interventions that might help address those, but they really lack the insight and the information about the priorities of the businesses and the timescales that utilities are operating on. And also quite often they think at a very small scale, so there's this kind of scale issue. And on the other side, when I worked with the utilities, quite often utilities and their supply chain, they're operating within fixed planning frameworks, fixed contracts, got rigid regulatory standards, and also, quite often quite limited expertise and therefore confidence in nature-based solutions. And when you bring that together, when I was working in the water industry, I kind of saw my sins of omission playing back to me as people came and tried to sell me really great ideas, really great concepts, but promoting schemes which weren't addressing any of the issues which I was trying to address. So they didn't match my priorities. Either that, or they had great ideas, but they came way too late in the process, so they couldn't actually have a meaningful steer on a program which might be rolling out over 5 or 10 years, but they're coming way too late in the project appraisal process. And also, so both the water companies I work for had a real genuine interest in nature-based solution or NBI, but it wasn't just the skills, it was also the time. So it just didn't fit into their planning framework, because typically you're doing something novel, you're doing something that's dispersed with lots of community interest. It just takes longer. It's much harder to do. So there's that angle, and also really wary about taking on additional risk. And that question of risk is really key, because if you don't have a compelling proposition, if you don't understand it, people are really wary about putting money up front into feasibility, because that money's at risk, or investing significant money into getting to an investable proposition. So really having a clear early stage, really having a clear proposition that's sellable at the early stage is crucial. And reflecting back at my role now at TNC, the Resilient Watersheds program, we're trying to break those barriers down. So we're doing a lot of, our strategy is very, very simple. Demonstration, so actually learning by doing. Taking that demonstration, training and offering training, not just to NGOs and the people on the ground, but also the investment institutes and utilities, so actually offering training and support. And also policy and legal, so kind of trying to understand what are the barriers and get really deep under the skin of the issues which are stopping things from happening in different jurisdictions. And we support that. We've got generic tools like the Water Fund Toolkit, which steps people through the process that might get them to an investable proposition. We've got Waterproof, which is a great kind of screening tool, and we produce a lot of local guidance and local tools to help people in their particular geographies. And what's really crucial as well is looking globally across the Resilient Watershed program. Philanthropy has been really key in unlocking some of that, because getting through those early stages where there's significant risk or uncertainty, or there are kind of barriers between different communities trying to promote, trying to reach the same outcome, but maybe have different ideas how it might be met. Philanthropy has been really key in that, but we've got an absolutely laser focus that philanthropy can only take us so far. So all of these programs ultimately are looking to unlock private investment at scale to really kind of deliver it at a watershed scale.
Great. Thanks very much, Rob. Yeah, really interesting to hear it, and really, taking note of this idea that a lot of the times the ideas are coming along too late in the process, and there's sort of a mismatch between sort of a knowledge mismatch between people who are promoting the use of NBI and have some of those the specific technical skills that are really important for doing them effectively, sort of being out of alignment with the processes and the sort of the other set of knowledge on the more traditional engineering side of things, I guess. So yeah, thanks very much. And I guess on that note, I'll turn to Juraj for the next question. We've heard from Rob here about some of these challenges of implementing and scaling MBI, and the need to really get in there sort of as far upstream in the decision-making as possible, a decision-making process as possible. And I know this is an area where GIB is working, so wondering if you could tell us about some of the work that you're doing there, as well as some of the particular challenges in doing that from your experience as well.
Thanks Rob and Rowan. I hope you can hear me well. So good afternoon. I would like to reflect a little bit on the challenges that we have identified in our project. So first of all, it's lack of capacity and knowledge on the local level that I would like to mention, because it's a very common, and that basically prevents key decision makers to consider nature-based solution as a viable option, as an option that they can consider when they think about infrastructure that they need. Then second, it's existence of governance structures. Historically, I mean, this has always focused on procuring gray solutions again, so we need new innovative governance structures that would allow and accommodate innovative adaptation solutions such as MBS. And last but not least, of course, we need more examples. I mean, we speak a lot about nature-based solutions, but there are not that many examples out there. We need to show to the decision makers how they work, how they perform, and how they're implemented in different socioeconomic contexts. So that's on the side of challenges, and I think this is important to mention. There are many other, of course. Just to frame this discussion a little bit more as well, the entry point, of course, for GAB, and I guess for many other institutions working in this space is that there is this urgent need to increase investment in nature. And according to the latest UN report, which is called State of Finance for Nature, it's clear that immediate action is needed from private and public sectors to increase investment in nature. And we know that this is quite massive investment that we need to do in the next years and decades. We're speaking about increase of or by $200 billion per year by 2025 and additional $500 billion by 2050. I mean, annually, this is a lot of money. And then the question is, how are we going to do that, right? And we see a great opportunity at GAB looking at the investment need into infrastructure, future investment need, because we need to deliver different kinds of infrastructure services to our society. And we can do that, of course, either using grey infrastructure or using nature-based solutions, or the combination of the two. And at GAB, we believe that one of the ways how to radically increase investments in nature is shifting investments from grey into MBS, whenever that is technically feasible, whenever that is supported by science, whenever that is supported by the local policymakers and politicians, and it makes business and financial sense. So, because of this need, of course, and this urgency and the barriers that we have mentioned, GAB developed a methodology called Nature for Catchment's Loan Tramp, which is a methodology that we designed to support investors, public sector leaders, and communities to guide the adaptation process. And it's a tool that shall be used mainly in the pre-feasibility stage to originate new project ideas and consider nature-based solutions as an option. So what is the result of this tool is a catchment level pre-feasibility study that includes nature-based solutions, different types of nature-based solutions of a different scale in specific locations in the catchment, and we make sure that these MBS are financeable and could be developed. So plugging this tool very early on in the process, when local authorities and regional authorities are thinking about infrastructure, we see that as a great opportunity because they can consider all different kinds of options. And of course, not always MBS is the best solution. We need to be honest to say that. Sometimes there's not enough space potentially, or there are some other barriers. But it's fair to say that it's important to always consider MBS as part of the wider portfolio of solutions. So I think I will stop here. This is a little reflection. I'm happy to continue.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jure. I mean that, yeah, a lot of what you said really resonates strongly with me and the work we're doing, and particularly this idea of taking what we would call a needs-based approach and thinking about, what are the, starting with the service need and thinking about what are the options for delivering this infrastructure service with the options available, and of course considering NBI as a potential option. I also, you talked about this need to sort of develop a stronger evidence base on performance of NBI solutions, and Rob also talked about some of the risks related to uncertainty about how NBI is going to perform over the long term. And one aspect of this is really sort of what are the full life cycle costs and benefits of NBI as well. And so here I'd like to turn to Mikhail, who's working on exactly this aspect at IISD, and particularly in terms of trying to understand better the full costs and benefits of NBI. So Mikhail, over to you, and could you maybe tell us a little bit about this work you're doing to try and help address that barrier?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. So I think it's quite natural that there's uncertainty around this relatively new type of infrastructure. as well as uncertainty around how to value its impact. So to address these problems, at IISD, we work with a methodology called SAVI, or Sustainable Asset Valuation tool, in order to basically help decision makers, either on the public or private sector, to invest in sustainable infrastructure projects, including NBI projects. So just a few words about SAVI. SAVI was initially developed to go against traditional infrastructure assessments that only look at financial indicators and do not integrate a wide range of economic, social, and environmental parameters, especially those that go beyond the immediate scope of a project. So with this methodology, we try to look at a project from a financial perspective, but also from a society perspective. And in order to do so, we have to value tangible impacts, but also intangible impacts. So there's three main features of SAVI that then we integrate into a traditional cost-benefit analysis, if you will. So first is simulation. We combine a lot of different modeling techniques, including system dynamics, project finance modeling, in order to show the financial performance of a project. Second, we try to assign a financial value to a wide range of economic, social, and environmental impacts, such as, for example, CO2 emissions, air pollution, jobs created, and so on. And thirdly, and really importantly as well, we try to customize our assessments to reflect local conditions and needs as much as possible. So all of these different features, and especially the valuation of these different social and environmental impacts, are there to reduce uncertainty as much as possible and to allow different policymakers or investors kind of understand their project and reduce risks, or plan ahead, if you will, to mitigate future risks, for example, climate change related risks. Now, specifically to nature-based infrastructure, in my experience, we've seen that these projects have even larger values when it comes to these social and environmental benefits. A recent example was a tree planting project in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, where we didn't only look at the direct cost, but we also looked at, for example, values related to fruit production, avoided costs related to flood damages, air pollution, CO2 emissions, and we looked at these values are very, very high and ignored very often in traditional infrastructure assessments. I think it's also important to say that at times a purely NBI solution might not be the most appropriate, and it's important to explore a hybrid solution where NBI can be complemented by a grey infrastructure solution. So, for example, I personally work a lot in sustainable transport, and at IISD we've been looking at a combined solution where a transport project in a city context could be combined with NBI. For example, a non-motorized transport network or an electric bus system could be combined with space used for green roofs, urban drainage systems, any kind of tree planting, cooling effects, and so on. So I would say overall, I think that it's important to remember that the value of sustainable infrastructure mostly lies in its ability to deliver a lot of benefits and to avoid future costs. But in order to understand that, it's really important to identify and value these impacts. And my last remark would be, from a personal experience, a lot of the projects where we do consider all these different social, environmental, and economic benefits and costs, the benefit-cost ratio is much, much larger than when we don't. So this is also something it's good to consider. And I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Mikhail. Yeah, that's really interesting and interesting to know that the analysis that you guys are doing at project level sort of supports the conclusions that we've found in this analysis of the potential for NBI to influence the SDGs, both in terms of the sort of scale of added benefits when you're able to take those the environmental and social co-benefits or into account, but also the point about the importance of really taking an integrated approach and considering NBI alongside great infrastructure options. I mean, this is something in the out of the sectors we analyzed in that SDG work, it was, I think, only 3 sectors where NBI is delivering services directly. In most cases, it's complementing delivery alongside other great infrastructure assets. So although, of course, there are times when pure nature-based infrastructure solutions will work, in the majority of cases, it's going to need to be sort of an integrated green-gray approach to really take these things to scale. So thanks very much for that. So one thing, just as a follow-up question to the panel, one thing that I think each of you touched on is the importance of local context and engaging local actors. And this is really important, I guess, in all infrastructure development, but particularly for trying to do NBI, where you have potentially a broader range of stakeholders involved because you're dealing with a wider range of benefits and potentially larger geographic areas as well. I mean, in all of your experience, I'd maybe ask each of you to just share quickly in your experience, what are some of the differences that you've seen in trying to implement NBI in different local contexts, whether that's sort of global north versus global south, or in urban settings versus rural? I mean, what are some of the specific challenges you've come across? Maybe I'll go to Rob first.
It's a really good question, and actually we're going to launch quite a significant piece of work to look at what the enabling conditions for NBI are, kind of looking across at different jurisdictions, trying to nail that question down. So I've got a hypothesis, and my hypothesis is that we look at like investment in NBI for water protection, water resources. We can see it really flourishing in Africa and Central Southern America, and TNC is involved in many projects there. I'm leading a project in England, and it is tough. It's really tough. And I wonder, one of the fundamental questions, and you do actually see this play out. I've seen this play out in other schemes in the UK around flood risk, and domestic flooding versus business flooding is actually power structures. And actually, so if you think about like engaging with landowners in England, you're dealing with some of the wealthiest people in the UK, very heavily regulated, but very valuable land, very robust and secure income streams. Getting them to move from their status quo is all about their risk and their legacy, and they're thinking really long term, and they're thinking about kind of multi-generational. My hypothesis is that in other jurisdictions, you might be dealing with people who actually have very little power in the system, very little income, and actually an offer of a kind of secure, robust income over many years is a completely different offer to them. It will play out very differently and at a different scale. So I think that's one of the things that we'll try and explore in that project is how does that power structure play out? It's not just about formal regulation, but actually who owns the power.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Maybe back into the studio there. I don't know if Juraj or Mikhail, you want to chip in? I think we've got a couple minutes left.
only a very quick remark from me. For me, it's more about which country or which location has data that is accessible. So for us, at ISD in order to develop our SAVI assessments. As I said, we need to customize it based on local data. And in a lot of cases, data is available. For example, the government is willing to share it with us. In a lot, it's not. And in this case, we need to use proxies or similar data from other regions or countries. So it's mostly related to that. This is the main challenge between different geographical locations or projects. Not sure if Uri, you want to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly because we don't have time. Yeah, just 2 points to mention. I think we were mainly active in Europe when it comes to our MBS portfolio. I think 2 things. One is that important is that you always have a potential investor working with you early on that nicely shapes the project and you can move much faster. And the second point to mention, I think it's important to make sure that you have a strong local partner who of course speaks the local language and knows the context, the local policies, has the network. That is very essential from our point of view. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Uri. So I think we're running out of time here. So maybe just very quickly to sum up, and well, first I'll thank the panelists for these excellent interventions, and many thanks to Global Infrastructure at Basel for organizing and give us the opportunity to talk about this today. I think for me, the big standouts from the conversation are really this need to put NBI options onto the table as early as possible, with as much data and information about them as possible. And I like this point you just raised, Uri, about bringing the investors or financiers to the table as well at that point. The local context, of course, and then this idea that NBI might not always be the best solution in a given case, but it's important to consider it, and in many cases it's going to have to be integrated and delivered along with grey infrastructure. So I think we're out of time, so I will leave it there and hand the floor back to Lorena. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rowan. Thank you to our speakers online and virtually. Thank you, Uri. Thank you as well, Michael. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much.
And Rowan, thank you for that really interesting session, from bringing the nature perspective back into the conversation as an integrated approach. And now, as we near the final lap of our journey together, I would like just to make a small recap. We have talked about project preparation, first regarding our vision towards a sustainable future, a sustainable and future-proof situation as well. And we have also talked about the curation process that these projects have to go through in order to meet that very ambitious mission that we have. We have also touched base on financing mechanisms, blended finance labels, and finally on nature-based solutions as an integrative approach that can address the interdependence nature of infrastructure and help us design a future-proof and resilient ecosystem. So to close the event, I would like to welcome again Louis Downing from Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation. So here we are, Louis. What an incredible ride this has been.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what are your thoughts about this whole day? What are your main takeaways?
I have so much going on in my mind at the moment, so many takeaways, not just from the sessions and the things that were said, but also things that were not said, and some conversations that we had in the lead up to this and between the lines. I'm going to brazenly speak to some of those between the lines topics in some of my takeaways. I think on the one hand, we really laid bare some of the barriers to sustainable infrastructure, including rising interest rates and what that means for high capex, low opex projects. Hopefully that's really stimulated some thought about what we can do about that as well. Then also, key concern of mine is this backlash against ESG, which is being seen in some geographies. I think we've also sharpened our view on the needs and opportunities to address these barriers in terms of policy, but also to have a more precise discussion on the costs and benefits of ESG. And I think today we discussed some really granular, concrete examples of that in terms of, how does nature-based solutions help to address some really key issues in a really effective and efficient way? How can circular economy be built into project design to reduce costs and see that the project is more sustainable? Another topic that we touched on throughout the day also was inclusivity of infrastructure. I'm really interested in that topic. I know some of the speakers that we had today have a wealth of knowledge that we just touched on today on how inclusivity can also really benefit infrastructure sustainability and also financial, improve revenues and also revenue stability. How did you find it, Lorena? What were your main takeaways?
Well, first of all, I really loved the event. It was quite engaging. And as you mentioned, Louis, there were so many things that were raised that are really key in project preparation and really speak about, for me, really the main takeaway was this important collaboration that we need to have right from the beginning at project preparation stage. And I think it was Sabina also that mentioned that we don't have time to be less ambitious, right? Really, we really need to act now to make infrastructure, an infrastructure that lasts and evolves through time and with generations. And I love how you raised the topic of inclusivity. I couldn't agree more with that. This is really one of the key elements at the core of infrastructure. And I also really like the fact that we spoke about convergence about sustainability issues, convergence about actors, but also convergence about standardization and how labels can help us achieve the future we want. So really, this is a wonderful time to be part of this conversation, and I think this drives me to the next question, Louis. What can we expect for next year?
Great, fantastic question. We've had a huge amount of really positive response to future-proof infrastructure as we've been building it out over the past months. And that's from the whole infrastructure value chain, which is really exciting for us. So based on that support, in the coming months, we're going to be building out the content platform. We'll be building out the pipeline of infrastructure projects. And we'll have we'll also be working on partnerships, right, to make this bigger and build it out and make it as effective as possible. So two calls to action for anyone who's been following along. One, pull out your diaries and mark a trip to Switzerland next year in April between the 9th and the 14th. Where we'll have a physical event to then touch base on all of the work that we've done throughout the year, the coming year. Then secondly, get in touch with us, talk about partnerships, how could you become a part of future-proof infrastructure throughout the year. That's what's in store.
Thank you for that sneak peek, Louis. I already have that in my agenda, so I'm sure that all our participants might have it as well. And everyone stay tuned for next year. And before we part ways, I would like to just remind everyone that is with us here in Switzerland that there will be a networking dinner at the Congress Center at 5 p.m. where you will be able to hear about Bertrand Piccard. He's a Swiss explorer, and he will be presenting about his pioneering work in solar technology and his vision for a sustainable future. Also, and I think, Louis, you will join me in this, we are extremely grateful for all our speakers and all our moderators, and also you in the audience that shared your time and your valuable and thought-riveting questions with us. Last but not least, I would really like to thank the GIB team, especially Nathalie Goyer, and also the team at MCH, who really are the masterminds behind this event, making it come together in the organizational aspects. So thank you very much. Thank you, Louis, for being with me throughout this journey. And thank you, everyone, again. See you in 2024 to continue building together a present that is future-proof.
Thanks so much, everyone.